Hello, I'm Alan Weil, Editor-in-Chief of Health Affairs. We're so happy you're joining us for our event today, Promoting Innovation and Equity as COVID-19 Vaccines and Treatment Emerge. Today's program is part of a series of events we're doing and papers we're releasing on the critical issues surrounding COVID-19. In particular, this symposium is in conjunction with some papers that we've commissioned that we'll be releasing in November to try to get an early look at some of the key policy issues attendant to the topics of vaccines and treatment. We've structured today's event around two general topics, although, of course, we will cover multiple topics, and there's even some overlap between the two. We're going to talk about innovation, particularly the development of vaccines and therapeutics, and we're going to talk about equitable access as these new modalities emerge. We're going to look at equity both from a U.S. perspective and from a global perspective. We have a terrific lineup of speakers today. We know you're going to learn a great deal. And I'll say a couple of times, we welcome your questions. You can submit them in the box just below the screen where you're watching us, and they'll come through me. I'll be keeping track. We have ample time for questions. The earlier you send them in, the easier my job is. So I encourage you to send your questions as they arise and not wait until the Q&A period. This event and the papers that we're publishing is possible with support from a broad range of organizations, and we're grateful to them. You can see them listed on the slide here: Anthem, Amgen, Avalere, Kaiser Permanente, the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America, Gilead, McKesson, Quest Diagnostics, Dynavax, Alexion, and Danaher. They have no control over the content, but we could not put on this kind of event without their support, and we are grateful for it. Now, if you're here with us today, I'm sure you're keeping up with the news, and I don't really have to give you the brief on the topics. We have passed 5 million diagnosed cases in the United States, with more than 175,000 deaths from COVID-19. Globally, in excess of 20 million diagnosed and 800,000 have died. Unprecedented efforts developing vaccines. We have, in the United States, we have Operation Warp Speed. We have a myriad private and public sector entities working as hard as they can to develop therapeutics and a vaccine ultimately. We have domestic efforts and we have global efforts, and you're going to hear about all of these. And of course, we just heard the news that the Russian Federation has announced that they have reached a critical point in vaccine development. Not surprisingly, there are significant concerns raised by commentators around the world about the likely safety and efficacy. So the balance between speed and safety and efficacy is always present in drug development, particularly here where we are so eager, where we see such dramatic global disruption associated with COVID-19. The race is on and the work is hard, but of course a vaccine that no one takes or a vaccine that is ineffective is of no use. And so figuring out how to assure that we don't just develop the right vaccine, but make sure that it's one that people will trust and use is critical. And then, of course, we need to distribute it. People need to trust the healthcare system. The systems need to be in place globally and domestically to make sure that the vaccines are where people are. And we're not going to develop 7 billion doses on day one. And that means we're going to have to set some priorities. We're going to have to think as a global community. And because all of those things are a ways off, while much of the attention is on vaccines, as it should be, there's tremendous need to focus on therapeutics as well. We have a long road ahead of us before we're at a place where we can say that vaccines are going to solve the problem. And in the intervening period, and probably well into the vaccine period, therapeutics are going to play a key role. And so in the public mind, probably vaccines get significantly more attention. But from a policy perspective and from a public health perspective, we have to pair these two together. And that's exactly what we're doing in our session today. So it's just so exciting to me because I know the quality and caliber of our presenters. I'm really looking forward to what they have to say. And I'm going to briefly introduce them, and we'll then move into our first panel. So to kick us off, you're going to hear from Orin Levine, who's the Director of Global Delivery Programs at the Gates Foundation. He represents the foundation on the governing board of Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and the Primary Healthcare Performance Initiative. He's been a tenured professor of international health and executive director of the International Vaccine Access Center at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. He was also our theme advisor on an issue on vaccines at the beginning of the decade of the vaccine. We'll hear from Nicole Lurie, strategic advisor to the CEO of the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, or CEPI. She's a senior lecturer at Harvard Medical School and has been the assistant secretary for preparedness and response at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. We'll hear from Phyllis Arthur, Vice President of Infectious Diseases and Diagnostics Policy at the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, or BIO. She's held a number of positions at Merck in their vaccine division as well. You'll hear from Esther Krofah, Executive Director of Faster Cures, which is a center of the Milken Institute. She has worked in public policy at GlaxoSmithKline and is Deputy Director of the U.S. Health and Human Services Office of Health Reform. And you'll hear from Rena Conti, Dean's Research Scholar and Associate Professor of Markets, Public Policy, and Law, and Associate Research Director of the Institute for Health System Innovation Policy at the Questrom School of Business at Boston University. So we really have a star cast, and that's just our first panel. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Orin to give us some opening remarks, and then we'll turn to our panelists for some reflections and reactions. Orin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alan, and a big thanks to Health Affairs for the opportunity to join the panel today. I'm going to make a few remarks. I'm going to try and get through them as quickly as I can because I really want to hear from these other panelists and learn from them as well. So let me just say, first of all, I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk about a couple things that excite me and I think a lot about. One is innovation, the other is equity, which is really central to the panel's theme today. It goes without repeating that COVID is a crisis, but it's also an opportunity, I think, if we think about it in the right ways, and an opportunity to learn, an opportunity to innovate, and an opportunity to collaborate. And so what I'm going to try and do is go through a few thoughts about where we see opportunities for each of those. Alan laid it out, whether it's a new vaccine or a new treatment, we need to be prepared to do the end-to-end work to make that save lives. We got to discover it, we got to manufacture it, we got to deliver it by the billions. And there's no one-size-fits-all approach for all of this. To reach everybody as equitably as possible, we're going to have to adapt and be well prepared. And if you take vaccines as an example, we're not helpless victims here. We have quite a lot to build off in terms of experience, but we are facing an unprecedented challenge at the same time. We've had success before developing vaccines for epidemic diseases. If you think about Ebola, meningococcal meningitis, Japanese encephalitis, these are all examples of outbreak diseases that we've developed vaccines against, and as a result are controlling at scale in a way that was unthinkable beforehand. But we've never had something like what we're facing with COVID. We've never had the scale, the age group distribution, every aspect of what we've taken for granted in the past has to be scrutinized and examined, from are there enough glass vials to put the vaccines in, to enough syringes to deliver it, to the financing available to make sure that everybody gets early access. These are all things that we have to do. The important thing to do right now is to make sure that we leverage that experience, that we avoid being overwhelmed, and instead draw upon the successes that we have had. And so that starts with learning. What can we learn from past epidemics? Well, if you think about when Ebola hit West Africa and more recently the Democratic Republic of Congo, countries and partners had to face a lot of the same challenges. They had to work quickly to set up new health infrastructures. They had to figure out ways to deliver innovative products in a local context, working with communities, and to build trust and keep up with the virus. So if we break it down a little bit more, what you find is part of the challenge that was faced in Ebola when we had a new Ebola vaccine was, without an international market for that vaccine, how were we going to make sure that there were enough doses and that they would be given in a timely manner? And what we saw there was the Gavi Alliance, together with industry, together with all the different affected countries, coming together to test the vaccine, manufacture the vaccine, and make sure the vaccine could be procured. But then we had one vaccine, and we wanted the supply security of more than one vaccine, and we got that. And that was great from a market standpoint. But at the same time, the two vaccines had different dosing schedules, different handling schedules. So we had a new complexity in the field, and the local governments and communities had to adapt to that. At the same time that the vaccine required adaptation, so did service delivery of all essential health services. So given the risks that communities felt in accessing treatment centers and that healthcare workers felt in delivering care during the Ebola outbreak, they had to manage a new way of delivering health services. And they had to prepare for the fact that during the disruptions in health services, some of the life-saving interventions that were regularly delivered were interrupted. Things like measles vaccine, things like family planning and contraceptive technology, things like access to in-facility deliveries. And as a result, in many of those places where Ebola became, highly established, you had as many deaths from diseases that were not controlled through essential health service delivery as you had from Ebola itself. In 2019, Democratic Republic of Congo had 3,000 Ebola deaths and 6,000 measles deaths. So these kinds of interplays are not things that we haven't faced before, but we can learn. We can learn from them, and we can learn to anticipate those challenges and build in a way to establish health service delivery to avoid some of the predictable consequences, whether it's a breakdown in treatment for malaria, TB, and HIV, or the lack of immunization services or maternal and prenatal care. We can take action earlier. I think in this outbreak, we have the added advantage of maybe being able to learn from each other as well. The waves of the virus and the outbreaks are affecting different countries at different points in time, and people are using different approaches. And some of those approaches are succeeding more than others. And so there's a real opportunity for learning in all of this. I'm reminded, I must have jinxed the poor country, but I talked to a colleague of mine in New Zealand on the 100th day that they had gone without a COVID case. And I said, David, are you in your office? Just as an American, that's not something that we're doing right now. And he said, oh, yeah. And I said, well, are you like wearing a mask? And are they taking your temperatures? And he's like, oh, no, we got all that. Now, they have since a few days later had another cluster of infections. But I think there is really something we can learn. He described a system that's really strong at contact tracing, gets results from testing back very quickly, and has just driven a different approach that I think we can learn from. Second thing we can do to get out of this crisis is to lean in on innovation, and COVID-19 is an opportunity not just for drug R&D, but for broader innovation that could help us fill healthcare gaps that we have right now in tackling COVID, and hopefully transform some of our health systems beyond the pandemic. Let me try and give an example of where I think there's a glimmer of hope in this. I'm kind of a recovering pneumonia epidemiologist. I used to do a lot of work in the field of pneumonia, and for years we would just say pneumonia is the leading killer of childhood of children, and hundreds of thousands of kids were dying every year of pneumonia. Many of them lacked access to medical oxygen, a life-saving therapy. It's a scarce resource in many low and middle income countries. Probably 10% of health facilities that should have access to that life-saving therapy do in many parts of low income world, whether it's Africa or elsewhere, according to some studies. So in many ways, millions of kids perished without access to medical oxygen, and thousands of cases of COVID are sparking an attention to this life-saving therapy that is accelerating and moving us faster than ever before in addressing it. So what you're seeing now is a level of collaboration between national governments, the World Bank, WHO, and UNICEF to do all of the steps that are required to help making medical oxygen more available. They're working on the supply chains, they're working on the financing, they're training health care workers to be able to deliver it. And I'm hopeful, not just kind of wishy-washy hopeful, but based on the partnership that I see emerging and the plans that are working at scale to implement medical oxygen, that on the other side of this epidemic, we're not only going to be treating patients with COVID with life-saving medical oxygen, but many, many others, including kids with pneumonia. Another of the innovations that we're seeing on the system side is in telemedicine. And I think what's really neat about what's happening with telemedicine is it's breaking a myth. I think there was a myth for a long time that that you had to go to a facility as a patient, prepare to be warehoused, to sit in a waiting room until a medical provider was ready to see you in order to get your initial consultation. And I think what telemedicine is doing is breaking that myth. And it's doing it in a really constructive way, a way that'll have, I think, potential positive implications for many parts of health systems. One is, I think there's a gender element to this. I think too often the unpaid work of caregiver responsibilities that landed on women meant that they were expected to take time out from whatever they were doing to be that person that either went with a child or on their own to be the primary caregiver for somebody in a place like that. And the ability to get a consultation without having to make that travel, without having to spend additional time on it, is potentially empowering in that way. I think it could also be a real asset for some communities that are unlikely to have the kind of access to medical professionals in their community, in their walking distance, that they're able to get through telemedicine. I've seen this myself in rural villages in Alaska, for example, where health aides are connected with specialist care that's available for their populations that would never live in the 600-person village of Shishmaref on the Bering Sea, but are available through telemedicine. So we've covered the opportunities for learning, the opportunities for innovation. There are many more, and you're going to hear more from panelists. Those are both also going to require us, including governments, to work on the policy side, because oftentimes it's not access to a telephone that is at the crux of whether telemedicine gets done or not. It's some regulatory or policy barrier that is linked to reimbursement and those kinds of things. And so we need to work through those. And I'm sure you'll hear about others in the context of developing life-saving drugs and vaccines and the like. Finally, we have a choice to make right now, which is whether we compete or choose a fragmented approach to solving this problem, or whether we collaborate. I think the virus has shown us clearly that it doesn't respect borders, and In my view, solidarity and collaboration are the obvious response to a threat, a virus that moves like that. One of the moments that I think is coming soon that will test us on collaboration is when we have a breakthrough on a life-saving vaccine. And I think it will be a moment for humanity in which we will be tested on the question of equity. Arguably, not having any vaccine at all for anyone is a situation of equity. Having billions of doses on the same day so we can vaccinate the whole planet is another form of equity. In between those two is where we live in reality, and how we handle it will determine exactly what kind of humanity we want to be a part of. I would encourage us to collaborate and to figure out a way, which I think is very plausible, by which we allocate the initial volumes of vaccine to make sure that we vaccinate everybody equitably, that we tackle this virus as a global problem rather than a nationalistic problem. I think that's the fastest way to get us all back to where we want to be in terms of getting back to work, getting economies restarted, getting kids back into school. And at least for me, I really want to go back east and see my mom and give her a hug. And until we get protection from everybody everywhere, that's going to be a lot harder to do. So with that, let me just thank you again. I think we do have three choices to make. Are we going to learn from prior epidemics or from each other in this epidemic? Are we going to strive to just return back to what we had at the start of this epidemic? Or are we going to innovate our way through to the other side, to something better, to stronger and more resilient health systems driven by better innovation? And are we going to choose to collaborate and bring the world back to health equitably and quickly? Or are we going to compete and extend the epidemic and exacerbate inequities? Thank you.
Thank you, Orin, so much for kicking us off here. Great way to set the stage. And now I'll turn first to Nicole Lurie for some reactions, and we'll just go sequentially through our panelists. Nikki?
Great. And thanks to you, Alan, and Health Affairs and all the sponsors for putting this together. It's obviously timely. The topics of innovation and access are not separate, linked really inextricably, as I think we all know. And I think Orin has set the stage really well for some comments about learning and innovation and some observations about equity. You know, when Orin and I chatted just after a planning call about this, you know, he said, well, I imagine that, you know, you're going to talk about innovative vaccine platforms. And I said, actually, no, I really don't want to talk about that. But I will, I think, picking up on Orin's themes, share with you sort of how learning got us to that kind of innovation and how the kinds of crises that we are in now has made us innovate not only on the technological side, but as Orin pointed out, on the policy side. And then finally, for those of you who I knew during the time I was assistant secretary, you know, my motto was sort of never let a good crisis go to waste. And so to think through how we leverage everything that we are learning in this crisis to really end up and envision the kind of world and the kind of communities that we want to have. So I'll say, you know, my own set of learning that's helped me think about innovation in this space, I think began during the H1n1 pandemic. Also a pandemic, obviously nowhere near as serious and deadly as this, but it did have associated with it a whole series of challenges. In that case, we actually knew how to make flu vaccines. And so we were able to make flu vaccines against a novel strain. And nonetheless, it took time. It was slow. There were bottlenecks. Vaccine doses were delayed. the U.S. held on to all the doses for a really long time and didn't make them available to the rest of the world, which caused a global crisis that we are still living with the consequences of today, et cetera. And once that was all over, I think we all sat back and said, well, what have we learned from this? And in particular, what are the things that we have learned about how to make medical countermeasures of various kinds, vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics, et cetera? We undertook in the U.S. government a pretty big review, which sort of concluded that we needed to get away from a one bug, one drug approach to development, whether it be in therapeutics or whether it be in vaccines, and launch this whole initiative about platform technologies, particularly for vaccines. So if you think Operation Warp Speed and these novel platforms that all these vaccines are being made on just came out of thin air since March, just think again, this has been a pretty long, I'm seeing some reactions here from Phyllis and Orin here. Just think again, this has been a pretty long time, in the making, with a lot of scientific innovation, a lot of technological innovation, a lot of innovation in business models and business partnerships that really got us to the point that we're at today. And I really want to highlight that first, because I don't think without innovation in those three areas that any of us could have, moved forward. So, for me, a second learning, just for my own self, was that, gosh, if a new pathogen shows up, you need to start really early in vaccine development. You can't make up for lost time. And so at CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, where I work now, we actually started on the vaccine development journey for COVID vaccines on January 7th, which was 2 days, I think, before the sequence was posted, reaching out to developers and partnerships and asking them, once the sequence was there, to begin work. Obviously, we didn't have the scale and scope of the funds that the U.S. government has, but I would submit that had that scale and scope of funds been available a couple months before it became available, we might be in a very different place with the epidemic today. But I'll also say that there were a bunch of things that for a pretty long time in the U.S. government system that I really took for granted. The U.S. government funds much of the basic science. It funds the translational research. It funds through BARDA the advanced development. A learning from this is that BARDA needs a emerging infectious disease fund so it can get start going at the very beginning of an outbreak. And I think that's a not make up for lost time thing. The U.S. government, as it did in flu, has funded the scale-up manufacture of multiple vaccines and manufacturing them at risk. Also not a new concept, by the way. It's something that happened also in H1n1. And then ultimately, the U.S. government purchases vaccines and makes them available, I hope in some version of free, to the U.S. public. And that's the system that we've had. And, every system has its warts, but in general, it's worked pretty well and it's produced products and it's gotten them out. When we at CEPI started developing vaccines and making vaccine candidates, obviously, as I said, we didn't have the scale and scope of funds. But as we got into this, one of the really big realizations for us was that we could proceed with development, but in the rest of the world, there's no go-to partner to fund all this scale-up development. There's no go-to partner to fund this manufacturing. If you want companies to be able to manufacture vaccines at risk, you can't necessarily expect them to take that on all by themselves. Somebody's got to share that risk with them, and there's no go-to funder for that. The U.S. government makes a commitment to buy doses if somebody makes them. There was no go-to entity to do that. And then the issues that Orin talked about in terms of finally, once you have vaccine, how are you going to get it out to the rest of the world and get it to people? Huge set of issues. A learning from me in H1n1 was when the U.S. government did decide to make doses available to WHO, it took 6 whole months for a vaccine to go from WHO to another country experiencing the outbreak. We mapped them out, 64 steps involved. But, at the end of the day, it was too late. So we have to also incorporate that learning. But what has that set of realizations led to? It's led to a series of policy innovations that are really profound. It's led to the world coming together with WHO, Gavi, and CEPI, and saying we need a financing scheme for all this. The ACT Accelerator, and within that, something called the COVAX Pillar, led by CEPI and Gavi, has been raising money and now funding the advanced development, the scale-up, the manufacturing. Gavi's going to purchase vaccines and they're working through a scheme to deliver them equitably to the whole world. And in this case, the whole world means any country that wants to join, high, middle, and low-income countries. So huge policy innovation there. And if I think in this case about where do I want the world to end up at the end of this, it's that we can't be passing the tin cup in the middle of an outbreak like this ever again. We have to have policies in place. We have to have financing in place. And the things that we're building will need to be improved, but at the end of the day, the system needs to look really different. Alan's asking me to wind up, so I just want to come back to one other little bit here, and that takes us back to the U.S. And I think in the next section, I expect that we're going to have a lot of discussion in equity about issues about inequality and about racial inequality. And obviously, we have to end up on the other side of this with a very, very different understanding and a different approach to those issues. We also have to end up on the other side of this with a modern public health system. One that links a real health system, that links our country's health system, which I hope will improve, to a public health system, and has an integrated approach to what it is that we do in health and public health. Orin talked about New Zealand. If you look around the world, it could be Thailand, it could be Canada, it could be lots of different places. They've all got much more integrated health and public health systems. They're modern. They use modern health IT. They use modern principles. They achieve equity in a way that we haven't. And my hope for the end of this is that the U.S. ends up seriously talking about this kind of modernization, not just for the CDC, but for the entire system. So why don't I stop there?
Thank you, Nikki. We're just going to keep going with our responses, and I'll turn now to Phyllis Arthur to give us a few comments.
Thank you, Alan. Thanks so much to Health Affairs for inviting me to join this meeting. I'm going to actually use a few slides, but also add some points to those on some of the issues raised by Dr. Lurie and Dr. Levine. So it's just a few slides to kind of show where things are in terms of development. I think that Nikki covered some of this, but go ahead, next slide. So we've been tracking at Bio through our COVID tracker about 700 products globally, drugs and vaccines, developed in under 7 months. And I think that goes to what Dr. Lurie was talking about. Industry went very rapidly, both on its own, in collaboration, small and big companies, and certainly then with governments, to look at products and try to see what products could actually be brought to bear on the pandemic. And so for me, one of the first innovations I'm hoping we keep is that industry to industry collaboration. I was so pleased to see how companies who were big, who had testing facilities, opened their doors up and said, hey, I will test your asset if you want to see if it works for COVID. That spirit of collaboration, even on the private sector on its own, was extremely important in helping smaller and mid-sized companies see if they had something that could be leveraged for COVID. That would have been, facilities they wouldn't have been able to find on their own, they would have had to pay for. So what we see, therefore, is a lot of drugs and vaccines in development. You see there's 179 vaccines globally, antivirals, a bunch of treatments. As you know, COVID has a litany of organ-specific issues that need to be treated, maybe with new products. So we've broken them into these 3 buckets. And we're starting to see some failures, which I'll say from someone who's been dealing with drug development a long time is actually a good thing. We need to start separating the wheat from the chaff and figuring out what works and what doesn't, because 700 drugs is a whole lot of things to follow week on week. I think what's really interesting innovation-wise is seeing what's happening with this antivirals, monoclonal antibody space. I think we're going to see some revolutionary movement on the treatment side for a type of product that is both, could potentially be prophylactic, post-exposure prophylaxis, treatment of severe disease. There's a lot of innovative flexibility with another platform that sits on the treatment side, but straddles prevention and treatment and could actually be extremely helpful in short-term protection while you get to a vaccine or as you look at things. So there's a lot of actually innovation and potential policy flexibility from the clinician side when the armamentarium is finally full of both vaccines, monoclonal antibodies, and antivirals. Next slide, please. So one of the things I think was also innovative in the drug development side is the work that was done by companies to look at what we call repurposing and redirecting. So companies looked at their assets, and I think the Gates Foundation had a lot of interplay with industry in this. You know, the first thing everyone did, they looked at everything that was already on the market and said, would it work? And I think that was a smart way to go quickly on the treatment side. And even a couple of vaccines, you see companies looking at BCG and some measles and other vaccines to see if they would be active. And I think we have to do a kind of all-comers approach in the beginning. But in particular, I think what's exciting was the redirecting, where companies had products that were in the middle of being developed for other diseases. Maybe they were infectious diseases or maybe they weren't. And they redirected those to look if they worked on COVID. And I think you see, particularly in the treatment space, a lot of redirecting and repurposing because, as we said already, many of the negative consequences of COVID infection and severely ill are problems for respiratory diseases writ large, inflammation, these different things. So can we get a couple of products that work in ARDS, for example? Well, that helps us with COVID, that helps us with flu, that helps with pneumonia. So the idea of leveraging a pandemic to actually have a suite of products on the treatment side that work for the consequences of that kind of disease could be very important as we move forward post the pandemic and start to look at what the suite of drugs looks like, particularly in that on the treatment side, and particularly treating those consequences of these diseases writ large. Go ahead, next slide. So I think we intimated this before, but there's a lot of different modalities being tried, and I think that's important because COVID has kind of stumped all of us with its ability to morph the way it moves. Yes, it doesn't evolve like flu, but the things we're learning about the disease and its consequences mean that we need to look at multiple different mechanisms of action on the drug and vaccine side. And I think what's exciting is to see the depth and breadth of technologies being brought to bear. So certainly we always need small molecules. They're easy to take. They're to some degree easier to make, not completely, but some degree. So of course we need classic antivirals, but this is an opportunity to test the mechanism of actions of things that were kind of sitting on the sidelines in preclinical that might actually be extremely powerful. So cell and gene therapies, of course, monoclonal antibodies, antisense in the vaccine space, the nanoparticles, the DNA and mRNA vaccines. This is our chance to actually kind of go big and see what we can learn from these various technologies because we are trying to solve such an urgent problem. And what we will learn from these things will certainly allow us to go faster on the end for both regular unmet medical needs. A lot of these new vaccine technologies were being leveraged for flu. We know we need a faster flu vaccine. We know we need more efficacious flu vaccine. Some companies can now go back to that, right? And they will have learned so much about their technology that maybe we can more quickly innovate on flu, which has needed innovation for quite some time. So there's a link to these things in terms of the technologies being deployed and the data we will garner from the work going on for COVID-19. Next slide. So I love this slide, but I hate this slide. So we made this slide. It's taken from a New York Times article. I loved it because the language in it is actually relatively normal layperson explanations of the various vaccine approaches, which is hard to find. And so read the slide at your leisure because there's a lot of words there. But I think the key, what I wanted to point out is I'm excited about the gamut of technologies being tried for vaccines. You have everything from the tried and true of inactivated or killed virus to the very sexy but not yet completely understood, or not the depth of data, DNA and mRNA. They go from fast to slow. They have different depths of safety data they've used for different things, but they all have mechanisms of action that could prove themselves to be extremely important in preventing vaccine around the world. And I think what I hope we see is not just that many of these vaccine modalities work, I hope that's true, but in addition, the partnerships that big and small companies did between them with developing country vaccine manufacturers. I have many small biotechs that actually very quickly made deals with Chinese or Indian companies in order to bring novel technology to new developing country vaccine manufacturers. This is very exciting for leveraging these faster technologies globally, not just in the US. And so I think that innovation will be something we see long term as well. Next slide. So this is my last slide. I call it my race car slide because it's literally a slide that shows, and I move it every couple of weeks as the vaccines move along the spectrum into the different stages of development. I think that one of the things I hope we will see is not just that multiple disease products cross the finish line are successful, but that it leads to, I'll call for a different set of innovations outside of the vaccine development part, which is we're going to learn so much about how to distribute, even in the U.S., to multiple sites. How do you do this in the presence of social distancing and PPE? And is it cars in the mall where you get your vaccine through the window? We're going to innovate on how we deliver vaccines over the next 4 or 5 months, particularly when the multi-millions of doses arrive. Even the U.S. has never done anything this big. And so I think what I'm excited to see is, are we going to strengthen the public health vaccine systems that go with that? And I mean immunization registry systems, which normally don't have that many adults in them. They're going to have lots of adults in them, right? Lots of different locations are going to need to put data in there so we can track. We need to do pharmacovigilance in a way we've never done it in the past. And these products are different doses. Some of them are frozen and some are not, and you can only get the one you got initially. How are we going to track people for 2 shots? There's going to be a lot of innovation in vaccine tracking, both safety and effectiveness, that I hope endures well beyond where we are now, that will be extraordinarily important for the future of not just pandemic response, but routine immunization writ large. So I'm very excited about learning from these different things. It feels clunky and frustrating and it's generating a lot of agita right now. But on the other side of this, I hope is a stronger public health system for vaccines. So thank you for the chance to share some thoughts.
Turn to Esther Krofah for some more comments. Esther.
Yes, well, thank you so much, Alan. I've learned quite a lot already with this terrific panel. Grateful that Health Affairs is putting this on. So we've heard quite a bit already around innovation and what the potential for innovation can be with regard to COVID-19. And as Phyllis just talked about, we have really thrown the gamut, at what we can do from a technology perspective, leveraging platforms, as Nikki talked about, that were in development well before COVID. One of the things that's been top of mind for us as we look across biomedical research and innovation is, well, what are the innovations that are coming from a process perspective that we want to last well beyond this pandemic? So the few comments I will make will really focus on issues like clinical trial design, as well as execution. What we're beginning to see, whether it's the response of FDA with product sponsors that currently have trials that are ongoing, or even within the context, as we just heard about, with these treatments and as well as vaccines, what are we beginning to see and how we can accelerate the clinical development there? I'll start by just talking about master protocols. I mean, that's one of the areas where I think is a silver lining in all of this. Master protocols or trial designs that are developed in an adaptive way in order to efficiently test compounds, multiple compounds against a control arm. These give us the ability in order to make as rapid a progress as we can. As we right now understand, there are more than 2,000 clinical trials underway, between 500 to 700 compounds. as was just articulated. And many of these trials are enrolling patients in such a way that we may not learn as much, that generalizable data, as we could. And so the master protocol trials really offer us an opportunity not only to get quick information, but reliable information through the gold standard, randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trials that can actually be definitive evidence around the efficacy and safety of any compounds. We've already gotten answers out of these master protocol trials. The first, Act 1 through NIH, gave us the answer on remdesivir, that it helps to improve the time to recovery. We also got definitive answers out of recovery in the UK on dexamethasone as a steroid that could potentially help with reducing mortality, and that's been quite important. But it also gave us important answers on hydroxychloroquine, that is not effective for COVID-19, and answers around even an HIV combo medicine, that also proves to not be effective. So we need these kinds of trials. Many of them, of course, were already in development well before COVID, that now offer us an opportunity to learn in rapid form. For example, the I-SPY, which was focused on breast cancer, is now looking at patients in ICU with COVID to see what we can learn in terms of therapies that are effective. REMAP-CAP, that was established for viral pneumonia, is an example. And of course, ACTIVE, which is underway through a partnership developed between NIH and BARDA, FDA, a number of these entities. We can imagine a world post-COVID where these kinds of platform trials, master protocol trials, could be helpful for rare diseases, as an example, could be helpful for Alzheimer's, could be helpful for oncology. So that is an interesting really innovation in terms of how we're using it and how they're being accelerated internationally. Another one that I'll point to is the compression of research timelines. I mean, of course, now that's a double-edged sword, right? Because when we talk about the compression of research timelines, you don't want to leave the impression to the public that steps are being, shortcutted, and that safety is not top of mind. And in fact, it is in all cases. What we're talking about is how quickly we can gather data, early data from the trials that are underway, that FDA can analyze that data in real time, share feedback back to that product sponsor or their company around their trials that can accelerate the process. So you're not shortening whether you have individuals enrolled in a phase 1 or a phase 2 or ultimately a definitive phase 3 study, but rather how quickly can we learn in real time and collect data and analyze that data in real time. When we think about the drug development timeframe that takes 10 to 15 years and cost over $1 billion, we have to start to ask some really substantive questions around, does it need to be that way? Do we really need to take 10 to 15 years? Are we making the process more complicated? We can't continue the current pace, of course, with FDA burning the candle at both ends. But there are some important learnings that are coming out of the compression of the phases within these clinical trials that I think we really need to grapple with. The third that I'll touch on is decentralized clinical trials, the ability for remote patient monitoring, the use of telemedicine, conducting virtual clinical trials. Again, that's coming out of necessity with product sponsors and companies who are being impacted because their patients are not going into the clinic. They're not going to the hospital because they're afraid of exposure to COVID. And so they're allowing, through FDA, the opportunity for their patients to interact with a provider or clinician in these other ways. That can offer some tremendous opportunities to increase patient participation in clinical trials going forward. And even the issue around diversity within clinical trials. Right now, we know less than 5% of oncology patients ever participate in clinical trials. And the data is much, much worse when we start to talk about diversity within populations, minority, low-income populations, geographic participation as well. So telemedicine and telehealth, as Orin articulated earlier, could be opportunities for us to extend the reach of clinical trials in these virtual kinds of settings. And then finally, I'll just end with real-world evidence. I think, a process process that was already well underway in developing mechanisms for us to collect real-world evidence, integrate them into regulatory decision-making, are being accelerated right now, again, out of necessity. But what we're seeing is the value of combining data from patient registries, combining data from labs, combining claims data, and thinking through what is the protocol, the research protocol for us to learn from this data through observational studies that can accelerate the kinds of evidence that we have against different therapy. We're seeing data coming from patients themselves, for example, the long haulers, right? These are patients that continue to suffer symptoms of COVID well beyond when they may have recovered. That data can really be aggregated to help us understand what is effective for what patient population and what therapies. Of course, none of this can happen in a sustainable way without policy intervention, without incentives, reimbursement policies as well when we talk about telehealth and telemedicine. So we really have to look for an eye to the future that once the public health declaration has ended, will these innovations that we have seen also end, or can we start to embed them into our normal practice? So I'll pause there, Alan.
And we now turn to Rena Conti.
Yes, hello all. Thank you so much for the opportunity to join this outstanding panel and conversation. Debbie, can you start the slides, please?
I think they're up. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Terrific. Sorry about that. Just to begin, I know that we've all already said this, but it is really important that we think about therapeutics as much as we think about vaccines. Clearly, therapeutics are important to people who become sick over time. Next slide. There are approximately 300 new compounds in development to treat COVID. And many of them, we've already gotten some early data on successes. Next slide, please. Remdesivir is clearly one of them. However, new therapeutics really pose two challenges. Clearly, one of them is related to its price. Next slide, please. So remdesivir famously had a price tag of $3,000 for a course of treatment, but this is actually not the only therapy that's being developed for COVID-19 that has potentially a very high price tag. Next slide, please. Myself and my colleagues wrote a paper that was published in Health Affairs recently that reviewed all of the therapeutics that are in development and identified at least 10 that had very high price tags associated with them already, on the orders of thousands of dollars for a course of treatment. And so really, concerns about affordability and accessibility are writ large, particularly for these new therapies that are coming forward. Next slide, please. In addition, the evidentiary standard for approval is high, and remember, high prices of these products and risky R&D are fundamentally related topics. It's really the high prices of these products that induce innovators and investors to undertake the very risky and costly enterprise of bringing these products to market. Next slide, please. So, notably absent from a lot of the conversation that we have seen in the public discourse has been the promise of repurposed off-patent or so-called generic drugs to treat COVID-19. And this is interesting, despite some very recent successes, most notably the results of the recovery trial, which have suggested that a very commonly used and very cheap steroid can be used to improve survival in patients. These products are new. They're repurposed for this product, but again, the safety profile of this product is exceptionally well known and well established over time. Next slide, please. So myself and a handful of colleagues, Susan Athey at Stanford, Jonathan Gruber at MIT, and Richard Frank at Harvard Medical School, spent the past couple of months trolling through all the different international trials and also other published reports on potential drugs that could be used and have potential activity for COVID-19. This was a very overwhelming enterprise in many ways. We are thankful for many students who helped us, but we are also thankful for many colleagues at Hopkins, Stanford, and the BU Needle Lab for their help. What we found after we scrubbed the data and excluded the convalescent plasmas and all of the monoclonal antibodies from our data was that there are approximately 300 prescription drugs that were in development for COVID-19. Again, drugs, not vaccines, and that approximately a third of them, 100 drugs, were old drugs, generic, that had lost patent protection many years ago. Approximately half of them were actually on the WHO's essential medication list already, being used to treat other important infectious diseases or other types of chronic diseases that afflict people worldwide. And that many of them appeared to have some positive signal already of potential activity. Some had already been investigated or are already in the process of being investigated through international trials. I already mentioned the recovery trial. That's a UK-based trial. But there are many other international trials that are currently ongoing that are investigating these drugs for their activity. What was notable in our assessment was that the trials were largely being conducted overseas, despite clear interest in their use by investigators and scientists and others in the U.S. as well. Next slide, please. So repurposed generic drugs offer many advantages. One of them is clearly that they have established safety profiles. We know how these drugs work, and we know what their potential safety issues might be. They also already have low prices established for them. And because the trials already have safety profiles that are established, they might lead to faster and cheaper trials to be conducted as well. What's the challenge? Next slide. In a word, there's no money in it. So repurposed drugs have been touted as potential solutions for a variety of different conditions over the years. Notably, there is a pretty active scientific community focused on the repurposing of drugs for cancer, but also other immunotherapeutic conditions as well. But really, private industry, but also American physicians and hospitals, despite scientific interest, might not necessarily be interested in developing these products. Next slide, please. So as part of this idea that we need an all-in strategy for thinking about COVID, addressing COVID's risk to our health and our wealth, myself and my colleagues put together this plan to develop and repurpose existing therapeutics to fight COVID-19 as a blueprint for what we should do now, but also as a potential way to move forward to address other pandemics in the future. Next slide, please. This plan has three components. Both of the citations are listed already. We've already published our proposal. But really the key here is that we are calling on government to take on a much more proactive role on testing promising generic drugs to be used efficiently to test for the activity in COVID-19, but also for the government to take on a much more proactive role in manufacturing of these products to promote the availability if and when they become when there's a positive signal for efficiency. And perhaps most importantly, to take on a much more proactive role on designing and coordinating clinical trials so that these drugs can be used and tested really as both sole agent drugs, but also in combination with each other, but also in combination with newer products as they become available. So in the white paper that we've posted already, we estimate costs of this to be approximately $20 million per successful compound. That includes failures, relatively inexpensive investment given the potential promise here. There is historical precedent for doing so. Next slide, please. This proposal is really designed to facilitate successes that we've already seen, but also reduce some of the failures. As you all know, with hydroquinone, we saw there were over 200 trials that were ongoing at the height of people's interest in this drug. At the same time as these trials were going on, there were issues related to accrual. In other words, these trials couldn't accrue all the people that they wanted to for their trial to meet specific endpoints. There's also hoarding of these drugs, both in the US, but also worldwide. And perhaps of more concern in terms of equity and access, there was also price gouging that was being pursued by some of the companies making these products. Next slide, please. So just to sum up, COVID-19 is obviously an all-out attack on our lives and our own economy. We need a proportionate all-in response. And I think just to echo the comments that have already been made by the panelists, my view is that there should be leadership that is being exercised by the industry, but also by public officials to bring all potential products forward that might be part of this response. We believe that generic drug repurposing should be part of that response. Thank you so much.
I have a nice list of questions that have been submitted. I'm a little worried that I'm going to ask this first one and it's going to take our entire half hour of discussion time. But, you know, if that's how it goes, that's how it goes. We have a nice amount of time here. But I want to pull together a few of the questions that I've gotten, and they pull in threads that have come up from so many of you. We're of course, a policy journal at Health Affairs, and there's no policy more central than payment policy. And it creates the incentives for investment. So, Phyllis, you talked about some of the treatments straddling different categories. Rena, of course, you talked about repurposing already existing treatments. We've heard a lot about the investment in innovation. I guess the broad question, and I'd really, in many respects, think I'd benefit from a conversation amongst you all. You know this better than I, but when I think about the current regulatory and pricing regime, it's very siloed around different types of technologies and products. They're different defined pathways. And from all of you, I'm hearing the potential of breaking out of those as a way to both accelerate discovery and affordability and availability. So I'd like a little primer from you all on what are the key elements of the current regime that thinks about things in these very discrete categories that need to be reconsidered quickly, and some, Nikki, that you said have already been reconsidered in advance. We're not starting from scratch here, but what are the key elements that have to be rethought to facilitate the kind of investment and innovation that we need? Who wants to go first? You are not a shy bunch.
No, we're not, are we?
Phyllis.
Not a small question either.
No,
I know
exactly.
It's not a small question. That's why I think it may take a little while. Love to hear your thoughts. Phyllis, go ahead.
I think that I think that the focus should be on value. And I think that in essence, if we actually focus on value delivered in infectious diseases, what's interesting is you talk about certainly the value delivered to the individual. And then, of course, you also talk about, particularly for vaccines, the value delivered to society because of community immunity, et cetera, interrupting transmission. So I think value is where I think we need to spend more energy. Some of the discussions around whether price points are too high, et cetera, they may not take into account the curative nature of things. If something is curative, how does that value? If something prevents for a long time, what's that value? So I think as an economist, I think about these things in terms of that net present value, right? If indeed I am getting you whole again, and that has a different value than if I'm just getting you off the ventilator, but we still have multiple years of treatments to go. I think that discussion of value-based pricing, value evaluations. Vaccines are evaluated this way. The ACIP, the CDC's Advisory Committee for Immunization Practices, looks at the health economic value of the product, not just to the individual, but to society. And that factors into how it's recommended. It's not the only thing, of course, it's a piece of it. But I think value is the thing that we need to inject into the conversation writ large, and make sure we're looking at things that are curative in a specific way for their value or fully preventive for their value. So that's my kickoff to an interesting conversation.
So I guess, so I'll answer this slightly differently, which is there are so many unknowns. We have 2 drugs, maybe, that have potential for use right now. One of them is an inpatient drug, remdesivir, that has a fundamentally different pricing and distribution metric than the average drugs that Americans fill the prescription at the pharmacy and pay for through insurance and out-of-pocket costs. The drugs that are likely to come out next, including convalescent plasma, are also going to be drugs that are going to be very similar. They're going to be used in the inpatient setting. Really, it's hospitals that are acquiring them at a particular price, and then passing those costs off to patients and providers. In the future, we will have drugs, hopefully including steroids and other things that will be used in the outpatient setting. And that's where exactly what the price is and for whom, particularly the consumer, I think is going to become increasingly at issue. I guess I would say the other issue that, again, is just a great unknown is that who's purchasing these products? We still don't know. Right, remdesivir is being purchased through the national stockpile for now. Ultimately, there will be commercial distribution, but will it look like the other inpatient hospital drugs? Maybe not. So how do we think about those prices that are being set?
So I might then approach this from a third perspective yet, and maybe in terms of Phyllis's comments on value, also remind us that the value to the economy overall is tremendous, right? So hundreds of billions of dollars per month in terms of global GDP as a price of a vaccine. So I think a couple things. One is, what's the financing for who gets into this when something happens? Okay, I think what we learned from Ebola and Zika is the U.S. government got people going. Looks like Rena is frozen again. Got manufacturers into vaccine development, for example, and then kind of lost interest, particularly in Zika. And so developers ended up feeling like they ended up holding the bag. They didn't jump in when this thing started. And frankly, the U.S. government didn't make a lot of money available when this thing started. So there have to be, to your point, Alan, a whole set of ways of sort of financially de-risking this to get the products we want. And so that has to do with the way discovery, development, advanced development, manufacturing, all that stuff gets financed. And ultimately, if the government's going to foot the bill for this, that's got to get reflected in the price of a vaccine, even when it becomes commercial, that it really has to be affordable and reasonable and all that. So that would be one set of things that I would focus on. A second set of things I would focus on are a set of investments that de-risk the development process and maximize or optimize the chance of success. So Esther, for example, talked about a lot of clinical trial innovation. This is really huge. And frankly, for vaccines, for therapies, for anything, has the opportunity to reduce costs, cut timelines, improve outcomes. But there are some challenges with it. You know, one vaccine manufacturer doesn't want to have their vaccine compared to another vaccine. It's hard to get anybody to sign on right now to an adaptive trial comparing 3 or 4 different vaccine candidates because if your vaccine candidate doesn't perform as well, you're not going to get the kind of payoff you want at the end. And so that's an issue to solve. But frankly, if the government's footing the upfront bill, it seems like that's a risk you take. And to Phyllis's point, ultimately, pricing needs to reflect value to some significant degree. A third area where I think we're seeing a lot of progress, but there's a good way to go, is in the regulatory arena. I mean, we are seeing enormous collaboration and flexibility from the US FDA, from EMA. We have regulators around the world who are meeting on a very regular basis to look at the candidates, to share scientific advice. I think we all dream of the day when we've got vaccine platforms that you could regulate the way you do flu and, you know, be able to change pathogens, but that can't happen until we know they're safe. But there's already, I think, a fair amount of de-risking that's happening on the regulatory side. And I think that those pieces are also really important. And then finally, I think what's happening right now with this, hopefully, effort around solidarity and global purchasing is also changing the financial equation for many of the companies and for the whole thing. So if, in fact, you've got these big global purchasing pools and you're purchasing on behalf of billions of people, right? You are creating a market demand that's unprecedented. You ought to be able to drive down prices. You ought to be able to get more players into the game and hopefully make these things much more reliable. The final thing I'd say, and I think Esther alluded to it, maybe not as forcefully as I might, is some of this is about financial incentives, but there is no substitute for leadership. I do not think you can respond to a pandemic without federal leadership. I do not think you can respond to a pandemic just thinking that the market forces are going to work. And even as we work with the market forces and the regulatory system we have and the pricing structures we have, if this whole thing had been a whole lot better coordinated, you know, we'd also be in a super different place. And so pricing and pricing incentives and all those things are one thing, but they can't operate in and of themselves without leadership. Over.
Esther, do you want to jump in? Don't want to put you on the spot.
Well, I think a lot of the points Nikki has made, as well as Rena, which is really you have to think about it in terms of it's a repurposed agent or a novel agent. And I think that's really where we're going to have to go, particularly cost to individuals or the cost that we're going to bear within healthcare systems. You know, I think with the repurposed products, a lot of the benefit there is that it's low cost. And I think about the equitable distribution globally. We have to think about this crisis as it's not a US crisis, right? If we want to really contain COVID, it has to be contained everywhere. And so our approach to either a therapeutic or a vaccine has to keep in mind, is there a therapy available that can be distributed where you don't have a mature healthcare infrastructure, where everything is going to need complicated IV infusions for patients that are ventilated in ICU, right? That cannot be a solution that solves this problem for us globally. So there's a lot of hope actually in repurposed products, particularly the cheap generic products that can't have that long reach, right? The good news about that is that they're cheaper. In terms of the novel products, one of the things that I have been concerned about, even with remdesivir, is that the U.S. locked up 90% of the early supply. What does that mean for the African Union countries or for other countries that are looking for the therapeutic options? And so we think about what's next. Even convalescent plasma is not straightforward in its administration. And how is it going to be straightforward everywhere as we're seeing cases pop up, particularly in parts of the world where we don't have that ability to very quickly get the donation, match it up to the right patient, get them infused, and monitor their care. So I think, for us, we need to be focused on what are the solutions that can be scaled globally. I like the fact that the Gates Therapeutic Accelerator and other initiatives are trying to think about this from that global perspective and scale, because that's really how we're going to get to the bottom of this. On the vaccine side, patients are going to expect it's either zero cost or very low costs. And to the extent that they're going to see high out-of-pocket copays, we're already talking about a deficit of trust, coupled with potentially prohibitive cost levels. That's not going to help us get to where we need to be either, with not having the level of population uptake that we need.
So can I just jump back for one minute about repurposing? Because, one of the things I think that helped us move forward in vaccines is even though CEPI was a young entity, it was there. It sort of had a mandate. There was an expectation as a go-to global entity to make vaccines. There is no go-to global entity to repurpose drugs. Nope. And we can do some stuff in the U.S. government with federal coordination if we can get to that point and happening. But I think it's a little bit of a fantasy to say, if we just had this whole library of repurposed drugs and we went and checked out the old repurposed drug that we wanted, the next time some pathogen shows up, we're all set. You need a go-to entity that is up and running, that can do the structural biology, that has a standing warm base of trials, all those things. And so the other thing you need are standing go-to entities with a mandate and responsibility to do this stuff. You can't start them in a crisis.
Orin, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I've been listening to the other panelists and thinking a lot about their presentations as I think about this. So I've had a couple of thoughts based on this. One is in her presentation, Nicole said, start earlier. You can't make up time that's been lost. And others, Phyllis talked about we need different approaches. Esther talked about how we can accelerate the process of studying these things by analyzing in real time. And, Rena pointed out we need an all-out attack. We have an all-out attack. We need an all-in response. It strikes me that one of the themes out of these comments was working differently. And I think while value-based pricing might lead to greater market incentive to overcome barriers, I think there's a difference here that needs to be acknowledged, and maybe a different need, a little bit off of Nikki's point here. I wonder if it's more like you got to pay for insurance rather than you pay for each individual thing that overcomes the obstacles. That I don't come from a defense background, but my understanding is that in the defense industry, you spend a lot of money for weapons that you hope to never use. And we don't treat it that way in health spending. We look for parsimony, we look for efficiency, and perhaps in the pursuit of that in all things, we miss the value of maintaining a warm base of capacity and capabilities to repurpose drugs or to develop a new vaccine or whatever that innovation might need to be. That is a different construct of both financing and conduct. And then lastly, I really hope that one of the things that will come out of this COVID experience is innovation around the regulatory process. I once was on a panel with a former FDA commissioner who may or may not be joining us later, in which I provocatively challenged her, just think about, like, can we look back at our last 50 vaccines that we approved or drugs or whatever, and look at all the stuff that we asked for, and then look at the stuff that mattered for what actually was the experience of using it. And I think actually that same idea of learning and trying to distill down to a sustainable but agile regulatory environment could get us a long way to the kind of flexibility that we need going forward. It's not just about money and financing, value-based pricing, but actually lowering some of the unnecessary barriers while reinforcing very rigorously the ones that we need to make sure that we protect the safety of populations. Over.
Phyllis?
So I actually wanted to make sure, thank you, Alan, that we differentiate between pricing and coverage, because I think that our focus is on coverage. And so even as we're thinking about the vaccine issues, there are, with vaccines, because of the Affordable Care Act and what's done with Medicare and what's done with vaccines for children, we have, unfortunately, this set of adults who actually may not have coverage if they don't meet the Medicaid requirements or the state hasn't expanded. But when we look at coverage for vaccines, a great many Americans actually have coverage where they pay either zero or a very small copay, except for what's happening with Medicare Part D. So I think that one of the things we're trying to focus on is actually looking at where the gap is in coverage, as opposed to just sort of saying there's a pricing problem. And so I think that one of the policy places we all need to have conversations is looking at drugs and access to coverage versus vaccines and access to coverage, and truly filling specific slots where there's a problem. We all agree a great many of Americans lost coverage in the pandemic. That means we have a huge bolus of uninsured people who we need to figure out access for them to treatments, maybe less so vaccines, but maybe not zero. And those things need to be solved both during the pandemic period, where most things are probably going to be relatively free. And then, of course, in the post-pandemic period, more importantly, whatever that turns out to be, whatever the post-pandemic period is. So I think that as we look at policy solutions, I'd ask us to think about how we make sure people are covered for access to novel medicines, and then things like value-based pricing and things like that come into play because they go through that filter of an insurer who's looking at those issues and providing that to patients in a way that is cost beneficial to them. So I want to sort of put an extra layer of language on, because I think otherwise it makes us focus on things that the patient may not actually see if they actually are covered. And I think it's about the patient-centered benefit, which for many Americans is invisible, but not for all. And so how can we fix the issue for all without necessarily undoing what's done for many? So that's my point on that.
Rena, you wanted to jump in?
Yes, thank you. And I'm so sorry for my technical difficulties today. It's never happened before, but new days. I guess I would say that I really liked Orin's comment about financing. We do need different financing mechanisms to address a pandemic that is fundamentally altering our economic lives as much as our health lives. But frankly, that is a public good, and that's what governments do. And so I think the American people expect, if we're going to be putting so much money into therapeutic development and we need to make sure and assure the American people that we are going to provide coverage, and that it's not going to be piecemeal where we're going to be nickel and diming people about whether or not they're going to get covered and for what they're going to get covered for, and whether or not the vaccine is going to be available. And again, for which vaccine is they're going to have coverage or not. We need to make sure that different people with different types of insurance have exactly the same type of coverage. And that forces a slightly different conversation than we are normally used to having about therapeutics, which is exactly who's going to purchase this, likely the government in some form, and exactly how is it going to be distributed to ensure that distribution is fair and equal and doesn't actually provide a significant amount of burden on individual patients and their families. So I'm not sure we'll ever get to commercial use of these products? And if so, I actually think that raises really fundamental questions. It's much easier actually to think about doing this in a completely separate system that guarantees access and affordability for all.
Well, I was pretty sure this one question would take us through all of our time, and I was not proven wrong. I do want to comment and maybe ask for some final reflections. It does feel to me that the pay for value is a bit of a trap here, and maybe I'm going a little toward where Rena was. I totally get that the investment you want to make should be in proportion to the value. Something that's a cure is worth more than something that then requires ongoing treatment or is a partial solution. But if truly price reflects value, then all of the benefit is recaptured by the private sector. There is no public good in a full value pricing. And that can't really be what we want here. And I'm thinking about Rena's proposal. What you want is some entity, and I think given the reality, it would have to be a government entity, saying there's potential value for things that currently are at a low price. So we should create a vehicle to make an investment proportionate to the potential value. But that doesn't mean that the ultimate solution is to, multiply the price of the generic drug tenfold just because it now works on COVID. That's certainly, that can't be I think it's fair to say that can't be the answer that we want. So value it's really helpful at the investment stage, but for something that's a pandemic, if price truly captures value, then that's the privatization of all of the economic and health harms associated with the pandemic. And not only can we not afford that, but I don't think we want that. Is that am I getting to some truth here that we can agree upon before we hand this over to the second panel?
I guess I would say that we absolutely want the private sector investing as much as they possibly are willing to do, and in products that will be effective for COVID, for the next pandemic, and for other diseases as well. Normally, we reward high prices for that. Here, we are in a situation where we might want to make a bargain, which is we pay less per unit, but we guarantee universal coverage and the underwriting of manufacturing costs and other types of costs to make it continually worth investors and innovators' while.
So I think I'm going back to something that Nikki said earlier. This is the medical countermeasures model we're talking about. And I want to make sure that we differentiate between straight commercial product, unmet medical need, clear. I calculate, I know this many diabetics. This is how much, that's different than the MCM space, where I think the partnership, if you look at the history of MCMs, under the ASPR, like Dr. Nicole Lurie, and you look at that, it has been a history of investing in the partnership of the advanced development, the manufacturing scale-up, and procurement based on use, very much like Rena just said. These are products that either could be used in limited amounts, a new antibiotic. They could be used for a biothreat. They could be infrastructure for pan flu. And EID, emerging infectious diseases, is probably the most confusing space in there, because these are products that could actually have both a pandemic value, and then supposing an EID becomes an endemic disease, also a commercial value. That's not true for anthrax. If it's true for anthrax and smallpox, we're in a whole different world, right? So this is about those things that straddle these markets, and how do we build the public-private partnership to do what you're saying, Rena, in a way that encourages companies to do the kind of great work investing in novel technologies for EID and manufacturing that's flexible for EID, knowing that you're waiting for the next disease X to show up and then everyone responds. And that's done in that public-private partnership way that guarantees pandemic coverage and access in a fair and equitable way. That's a slightly different system. And I think CEPI is a really good model to look at as the beginning of that. And then I think there's other things we can leverage. We're talking about a slightly different MCM model around a unique set of products with more enduring than the classic CBRN product. And that's a conversation that as industry we'd love to engage with stakeholders on, because it's been missing in our armamentarium on pandemic response.
I agree.
Okay, so I'm sorry, Rena. I'm going to have to. I think we did great justice to this topic, and as always, they're unanswered questions. I really seriously have to apologize to all the people who sent in questions on other topics. I did know that this would not be a quick and easy one, but it captures so many of the angles that are important. And I realize, and I like the comment, it's not just about the incentives. Clearly, it is about leadership, and it's about collaboration, and it's about trust. And but from a policy perspective, the one lever that people often are looking at is on the payment side, on pull and push investments. And I think we've had a really terrific conversation about those. So I just want to say thank you to an exceptional first panel for getting us started. I could not have asked for more. And as we let you all go, I'm going to go ahead and bring in and introduce our second group. But again, thank you all for getting us off to such a terrific start. Our second panel is going to focus on equitable access to vaccines and therapeutics, an issue that certainly came up in the first panel. Those of you cannot have missed. In the United States, we're seeing tremendously disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on minority communities, on Black and Hispanic communities in particular. We're seeing distributional consequences around the globe that are very telling of the health of health systems and the underlying burden of disease, the quality of public health infrastructure. These are all relevant to having an equitable response as our vaccine comes online and as our therapeutics mature and come online as well. We're going to hear today from kicking off will be Peggy Hamburg, who was the 21st Commissioner of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, just completed a term as Foreign Secretary for the National Academy of Medicine and as President of the American Academy for the Advancement of Science, the AAAS. She has been the Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services for Planning and Evaluation, the Commissioner of the New York City Health Department, and other important roles as well. Following her opening remarks, we're going to get responses from a really terrific array of speakers. Garth Graham is the Vice President of Community Health and Impact for CVS Health, President of the Aetna Foundation. He's a cardiologist and professor of medicine who was Deputy Assistant Secretary in the U.S. HHS under Presidents Obama and George W. Bush, who led the Office of Minority Health and the first health disparities plan for the United States. Angela Shen is a visiting research scientist in the Vaccine Education Center at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, retired captain in the U.S. Public Health Service. Mark Feinberg, President and CEO of YAVI, the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative, formerly Chief Public Health and Science Officer at Merck, and was on the faculty at the University of California, San Francisco, and the Emory University School of Medicine. Gavin Yamey, Director of the Center for Policy, Impact, and Global Health at the Duke Global Health Initiative, previously having led the Evidence to Policy Initiative in the Global Health Group at the University of California, San Francisco. And Rebecca Weinstein, who leads Ariadne Lab's Better Evidence Program, also an assistant professor at the Harvard Medical School and leader of the Global Health Delivery Project. So domestic and global chops, ability to speak to these issues from a variety of perspectives. And without further ado, Peggy, I'm going to turn it over to you to kick us off on our second panel. Thanks for being here on what I know is an incredibly busy day in your world.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here, and I enjoyed the first panel. I do think that this is, a lot of speakers and a lot of issues. So I'm delighted that people are staying on with us for the second session. I will try to be brief because there really are, as you just heard, such a great set of panelists, and 5 of them who will go more deeply in. But I was asked to just kind of broadly set the stage. And I think, in fact, the first panel and Alan's remarks have already broadly set the stage and said a lot of the things that I wanted to say. But I think, we really do have to underscore, the seriousness of this threat before us. It continues to confront our country and the world with urgent, serious challenges, the worst infectious disease threat in over a century. the third deadly outbreak with this novel coronavirus, or with a coronavirus, not this particular one, and something that has not only now claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, but it's really, overwhelmed our healthcare systems. It's disrupted society and the most fundamental of our social interactions. It's devastated economies. There's really no country or region in the world that has been immune to this novel coronavirus. And all of us will remain at risk until we can develop and implement a set of coordinated strategies to combat SARS-CoV-2 and to protect us all. And clearly, both therapeutics and vaccines are part of that critical armamentarium of necessary tools. And, really, I think now, perhaps more than ever, the public and policymakers understand how important investment in biomedical product innovation and the applications of science and technology are to addressing fundamental human problems, as well as some of the biggest economic concerns and, frankly, national and international security concerns and challenges that we can imagine. So this is a critical moment in time. It's one where action is essential and where the scientific community really does have a unique and really quite extraordinary role to play. Clearly, in response to this unfolding global pandemic, we have seen just a remarkable mobilization of the scientific and research community, our medical care providers, and public health. But I really think when you look at what's happened in terms of advancing research and development of critical medical countermeasures, as we were just hearing in the earlier panel, it's been extraordinary. Remember, it's really only been just slightly more than 7 months since we first learned the identification of this novel coronavirus and, of course, the posting of its genome by Chinese scientists. And it has been very encouraging and inspiring, I think, to see the kind of collaboration that has been engendered between government, academia, philanthropies, and the private sector, and also amongst companies, and importantly, across borders. This reflects, I think, the magnitude and urgency of the problem, and also the recognition that it is a shared problem that we have to address together. We truly are all in it together. This session is really to talk about not only advancing the innovation and the application of science and technology, but how we do it in a way that is appropriate, public health and needs driven, and equitable. And we need to think about that, of course, not only in the domestic context, which is critically important, and there are a lot of issues and concerns that we'll be talking about this afternoon, but also in the global context. We know that the virus is going to be with us for a long time. We know that we're going to have to continue many of the interventions that we've shown can make a difference, the non-pharmaceutical interventions of social distancing, masks, hand washing, and respiratory hygiene, avoiding large gatherings, etc. But we also know that it is not sustainable. We really do need the drugs and vaccines that we've been talking about so that we can really ensure the kind of social and economic activities that matter today and matter crucially for the longer term. So this is not a small topic. This is not an inconsequential topic. And as we think about it, it also is essential that we recognize that the science and innovation is hard, but it also is hard to set priorities, to define how we're going to distribute what will certainly initially and maybe for the longer term be limited resources, and how we're going to balance public health and medical care need, issues of equity and solidarity, and the need to really define lasting, enduring solutions. We know that we are living in a period of enormous nationalism in our country and other countries of the world. And in a crisis like this, it's completely understandable that countries are going to feel a strong sense of responsibility to look after their own citizens, and they should. But for our country, first of all, as the leaders in science and technology, biopharma and biomedical product innovation for a very long time, I think we have an obligation and a special responsibility and a history of, really thinking and working and acting collaboratively, and we should be even more so in this context. But additionally, and beyond humanitarian and other interests, we do need to recognize that we will not be able to have those medical countermeasures, those medical care and public health tools that we need to move us to a new normalcy in terms of opening up of our lives and reinvigoration of our economy, and a greater sense of personal and population health and safety without that we can only achieve our goals, even in the most sort of selfish of ways, if we also recognize that this is a global problem, it is a global pandemic, and that we will not be safe within our shores and our borders without helping to ensure safety and disease control everywhere. So these are not easy issues, but at the end of the day, I think, we can and must address what is ultimately a shared problem, and the need to implement common, coordinated, equitable, and science-based policies and programs. So that's really what we're going to try to focus on in this session. And we really are so fortunate to have the set of panelists and discussants that Alan just introduced. I guess, just to reiterate a little bit, and I'm not watching time, so Alan, signal me if I need the hook, but obviously we need both drugs and vaccines. There's a lot of uncertainty in new product development or in trying to repurpose old drugs for new purposes. And we don't know where we're going to find success. We know that we need new drugs and better therapeutics for managing patients, treating serious disease and preventing death, but also to reduce the severity of disease, to perhaps prophylax against infection. And so there's a lot of range in terms of the therapeutic development that we need, but also a huge amount of activity, as you've already seen, mainly focused on repurposing now, but also the development of new drugs based on emerging science and understanding the nature of this particular virus and the human immune response to it, and falling into two broad categories of antivirals and immune modulators. But also, of course, now that we understand that this is a complex disease that has many different manifestations, also the need to address some of the other complications, including the hyperembolic state and other things. And then, of course, vaccine is the ultimate in terms of the the public health management and control that we need. And as you also heard in the earlier session, we're looking at quite a range of vaccine candidates and very innovative strategies to try to accelerate vaccine development, as well as invest in scale up and manufacturing, even when we don't know which of the candidate vaccines will make it over the finish line. And that, of course, is a huge financial risk now being taken on by governments and companies and philanthropies working together. But no matter what, we are not going to have enough initially. So we're going to be faced with these difficult questions of allocation and prioritization. And we may never have the vaccine that we're hoping for. So, a balanced strategy of drugs and vaccines is essential. And bringing the best possible science and technology to bear, recognizing the urgency of this problem to break down silos and overcome the kinds of hurdles and barriers that can be a drag to the system. And Alan's last question to the first panel addressed some of that. We need to be doing all of this with a sense of real purpose and responsibility and opportunity going forward. We need to press as much as we can, but without abandoning scientific rigor. And we need to always recognize that the fruits of science and technology have to benefit all people, and that we have a additional responsibility in this circumstance to really ensure that the right science-based and public health decisions get made with an emphasis on the solidarity of all of us vulnerable to disease and the reality that no nation can stand alone, and that we have to view this as a global calling. So I think with that, perhaps, and one other point, we also have to recognize that the science is hard, the scale up in manufacturing is hard, but even the best of vaccines will not be of true value if they aren't distributed properly and they aren't taken up and used by people. And we know that all of this is happening in the context of vaccine hesitancy and a lowering of trust and confidence in vaccine products, both because of the existing concerns around the anti-vax movement and vaccine hesitancy, but also in the context of this accelerated warp speed approach to vaccine development, as the U.S. vaccine development program is called. There are concerns, and the politicization of certain aspects of ongoing work in the drug and vaccine development arena, that we have additional concerns. So we have to be working on all of these fronts moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peggy. And before I turn to our others, I just want to remind those who are listening to us live that there is a question box below the video that you're watching, and I do have a lot of leftover questions from the first panel, but we have a somewhat different focus, and I want to make sure you know that the floor is still open to receive questions. With that, our first panelist responding to Peggy will be Garth Graham. Garth, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Alan, and thank you, Peggy, for setting that up in an amazing fashion and hitting on all the key issues as you often do. And again, thanks to the folks at Health Affairs and a lot of the folks who spoke in the last panel in terms of highlighting, at least setting the stage in terms of this issue on equity. I'm going to focus less on processes and talk about people. And as Peggy said, part of this is going to be understanding how do we get the vaccine to the people who need it the most, and how did we get into this position in the first place in terms of a lot of communities having, at least I would say, hesitancy, if not challenges, with much in terms of what's been talked about vaccines and therapeutics. I want to also tell you something. I used to always say this when I was teaching at the University of Florida. There's a lot of challenges that we are facing globally, and I think the next part of the panel is going to focus on that. There are also a lot of challenges that a lot of our folks in our urban communities, in our rural communities, in our low-income communities are facing right here. Sometimes you don't need to get on a bus and a train and a big plane and then get on another bus and a train. Sometimes you just got to go a couple of miles down in the local neighborhood in a lot of our urban communities. Next slide, please. And I often use this slide, and there's a lot of data like this that shows just how discrepant life experiences are in the United States. So this is a slide just showing differences in life expectancy in the city of Boston, and showing that if you go just 15 minutes down the red line, you go about 30 or so years difference in life expectancy. Why is that amazing? It's like going from 2020 back to 1920. And we have to understand the experiences of the individuals who are living in these communities and understand what they're going through to understand how we can best reach them in terms of this issue around therapeutics and vaccines. And what the concept here I'd like to kind of leave us with in terms of understanding is years of systemic racism, decades, and much longer than decades of systemic racism. Hundreds of years of policies, programs, and various activities have shaped communities in a way that we have Black and brown communities in the United States living in not only third world, but very challenging living situations. The lens at which they view the healthcare system, that's the challenge that we have to face when we then try to implement all of the sophisticated technologies we may be developing around therapeutics and vaccines, the kinds of things that have led to the sharply increased rate of death and despair in Black and brown communities around COVID-19 didn't just happen in 2020. It didn't happen in 2000. It didn't happen in the 90s. It didn't even happen in 1900s. It took a while for us to get there. And so we have to be cognizant of that when we reach those communities and thinking about how we reach those communities. Next slide, please. And so let me try to lay out to you quickly what I think in 3 minutes and 2 minutes, Alan, to get us back on time, are some of the concepts in terms of challenges. So systemic racism, and understanding how that played a role in us getting here. Historic issues, the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, and a host of other experiments that have happened in Black and brown communities, some of which maybe even still to some degree occurring in different formats to this day. And the way in which these communities, I know because I grew up in there, the way in which these communities have experienced the healthcare system and why they're hesitant when we have this conversation around therapeutics and vaccines, and especially using some of the hyperbole that Peggy just nicely articulated when she said, some of these terminologies create hesitancy in people who are fine with the healthcare system. What about those who are skeptical? And if they start to think that things are moving at a speed that may not be beneficial to them. Now, this is leading to challenges, not just in the future, but now. As many of you know, the ability to recruit Black and brown communities right now in clinical trials is facing a significant hurdle. And that is because, again, these communities have lived a set of life experiences, and I say these communities of which I'm a part of, or our communities have lived a set of life experiences that has evolved to this day. And so now you put the pandemic on top of it, you put all of the things that are occurring now, and it is fully understandable why we're seeing this degree of hesitancy, why we're seeing these series of challenges, and why we have to first understand the world and the folks and the background of where our communities are coming from, to then layer on what I think are some of the solutions. One of the things I'll say is that despite all of the challenges that we're facing, we do know that there are successful efforts that have reached Black and brown and other underserved communities, and we do know that there are strategies that work, and we should try to implement and think through these strategies when we think through this issue on equity and getting to communities. And so it's not just all about the technologies and how fast and how quickly we can develop both the therapeutics and vaccines. It's also about understanding the people. What are the lives they're living when they're getting up? And then when you say to them, here, take this, why are they going to say, well, hold on a second. This is what I know. This is what I felt. This is what I understand. This is my frame of reference. And their frame of reference is no worse or no better than yours or other folks. It's all a part of understanding kind of the lived experience. Next slide, please. So that's what I think is part of the kind of background. I want to give you a couple examples of two experiences I've had professionally that I think speak to how we can overcome some of those challenges. One, I'm going to talk to you about what we did around testing particularly at the start of the pandemic at CVS Health. And it's interesting, when this pandemic first started, earlier this year, we forget, there were some communities thought they were immune. There was all this issue, misinformation flying around at a variety of different levels. I remember walking to get my hair cut. And my barber was telling me, I don't think Black and brown people get these diseases because it was happening in rich communities. You're hearing prime ministers and other people getting sick. But you weren't hearing a lot of local folks. And that's when the communities was quickly spreading and, in fact, starting to devastate Black and brown communities where they are now. So we have to think about how we get information, how we're present, how we're there. So one of the things that we had done at the CVS, in terms of CVS Health, is we had set up a lot of testing strategies across the country. We worked particularly with free clinics, community health centers, community colleges, and places where there were trusted people, trusted locations, and where people felt comfortable in terms of where they had been getting their care, and also comfortable in terms of the kinds of people that were interacting with them, who were treating them with respect, and who had a long history of treating them with respect in terms of how we were able to adequately test those communities. And so we were pretty successful there. The lesson to be learned here is if you want to reach the communities, you need to be in the communities and utilize the kinds of individuals, people that folks are used to. Next slide, please. I'll try to wrap this up really quickly. And achieving access to vaccines requires a lot of things. I think this is kind of my 4-point strategy I'd like to leave you with. Engaging folks that are in local communities, being present, and making sure that the points and locations where we want to dispense therapeutics or vaccines, or even just thinking through those access points, they need to be co-located with folks that are already trusted. And we have to not underestimate this issue and the long-standing issue of trust. We have to make sure we engage people early on with information as soon as adequate information becomes available. Last slide, Alan, I'll quickly try to wrap up here. This is a slide that I often use to think through partnerships. There's partnerships where you just try to be present and give people stuff. And then there's where you try to work with people over a long long period of time to have true bidirectional community conversation and thinking through what I would say is a near seamless merger in terms of partnerships overall. Conclusion here, long-standing history in terms of how we've gotten here. It didn't just happen overnight, and it didn't happen just with COVID-19. We have to think through what's happening in Black and brown communities. If we don't get Black and brown communities engaged and other low-income communities engaged on the front end of our efforts, the back end won't get us to where we want to get. So thinking through as we get information, sharing that appropriately, being located, co-located, and thinking through trusted efforts. There are a lot of researchers, a lot of efforts that have been successful at various forms of this in terms of reaching communities. And I would encourage us to continue to think about that, not just the technicalities of vaccines and therapeutic serum production, but the people behind who need it the most. Thanks. I'll stop there and jump into the question and answer period when we get there.
Thank you so much, Garth, for getting us started. Let me turn it now to Angela Shen. Angela?
Great. Thanks so much, Ellen. Next slide. We've heard a lot in the previous panel about the various dimensions of the worldwide effort to accelerate development of safe and effective SARS-CoV-2 vaccines. When vaccines become licensed and broadly available to the public, a clear hurdle in the U.S. and abroad is equitable distribution and access to all who are recommended for vaccination. Next slide. In the initial phase, supply will be limited and targeted to high priority populations. And we've heard this theme throughout the previous speakers. So a tiered allocation approach will obviously be necessary. As additional vaccine candidates are authorized for use, the availability to priority groups and the general population will naturally increase. And this will occur under emergency use authorization or as FDA licensed vaccines. There are frameworks and existing systems for allocation, for distribution, for vaccination, and for monitoring of safety and effectiveness, which are assets of our current immunization delivery system. And these systems should be leveraged to ensure equitable distribution and broad uptake of licensed vaccines. Next slide. The Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices makes recommendations for use in the civilian population. In April of this year, they formed a COVID-19 working group and have been meeting frequently as they consider ways in which to prioritize vaccination groups. Notably, the use of a vaccine under EUA would be unprecedented, as all vaccines currently recommended by ACIP have FDA licensure. In their deliberations to date, there's clear emphasis on healthcare workers, on adults aged 65 years and older, and on high-risk adults with comorbid conditions. In parallel, the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, Medicine, and the National Academy of Medicine have been asked to develop an overarching framework to aid planning for equitable COVID-19 vaccine allocation. After establishing priority groups for vaccination, there clearly is an issue of financing and access to services, themes that were touched upon by previous speakers. Next slide. Insurance alone will not ensure access. While other nations finance immunizations as a basic, centrally purchased and managed public health service, the United States relies on a patchwork of inconsistent public and private insurance programs. In order to rapidly vaccinate recommended populations, the U.S. will need to streamline vaccine billing process, both for the purchase of the vaccine and for the coverage of an administration fee. This is particularly crucial for individuals on Medicare and Medicaid, as well as those who are under and uninsured. As for the purchase of COVID-19 vaccines, the federal government has committed to purchasing initial doses of vaccines. It has not committed to covering the administration fee for all populations, nor has it indicated its approach to future COVID-19 purchases, as we believe we'll need to continue to vaccinate additional birth cohorts. Next slide. A publicly funded program that could operate efficiently and quickly to distribute vaccines will be required to effectively respond to the pandemic. What we, I think, are building on are a number of critical lessons that we learned from 2009 and the H1n1 experience. And that included utilizing the Vaccines for Children program as the backbone for centralized distribution and ordering. In our experience over a decade ago, states were allocated doses proportional to the size of their population, regardless of disease burden and the number of state residents in ACIP target groups. States also developed plans to distribute and administer vaccines. And what's really notable about this bullet is that these state plans varied. Federal, state, local, and tribal governments, however, worked with providers to follow ACIP recommended groups for vaccination. Slide 6. In this current pandemic, there will be a joint effort between the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the Department of Defense. Where possible, systems should be strengthened to address gaps in access to immunization services, to modernize public health infrastructure, in order to ensure policies and practices at all levels, federal, state, local, and tribal, support equity, transparency, accountability, availability, and access. Next slide. As a mentor and friend of mine, Walt Ornstein often says, and many of you have probably heard, a vaccine dose in a vial is 0% effective. In this slide, we really are trying to get at the heart and the core of a lot of this panel, which is the challenge of reaching the right people in the right setting. States need to identify potential priority groups that have traditionally been left under and unvaccinated, and investments to strengthen public health infrastructure are critical. This includes the ability to track vaccine product and people throughout the process. Aside from the fact that they all start with P, we're trying to track the vaccine product itself, given that most likely will be more than one dose and the vaccines aren't interchangeable. Tracking the people, the adults, and the recommended populations stratified by their priority groups, and the process in which how this is going to occur, given each state it'll happen differently. As well as supporting staff in public health clinics, federal qualified health centers, and rural health clinics. Slide 8, next slide, shows a map. I couldn't figure out how to change the colors, but hopefully you'll like it. Is a network. It shows a network of the immunization information systems, often known as immunization registries. While the data saturation for children is high, this means about 95% of young children and 80% of adolescents are captured in this network of over 61 immunization registries. Only about 56% of adults are captured. What this reflects is a well-known variability in state IS infrastructure and policies about data capture and consent. Next slide. In my last slide, and my final slide and my final comments, they're really about public health policy and infrastructure. The mission is to deliver life-saving vaccines regardless of age, gender, race, ethnicity, religion, or income level. Vaccination is clearly an integral component of the overall U.S. strategy to end the pandemic, and ensuring equitable vaccine allocation and access is not only critical to protecting those lives, but vital in growing the public's confidence, not only in vaccines, but in vaccination and immunization programs. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angela. We're now going to turn our focus globally, and first up will be Mark Feinberg. Mark?
Thanks very much, Alan, and thanks very much to you and the Health Affairs team for organizing this event. Can I have the first slide, please? As Alan indicated, we are going to be shifting gears to a global perspective, but I also want to focus on a somewhat different topic than has been raised here today. Certainly, I'm a big believer in the importance of access to vaccines, both nationally and globally, but there is an area that I think the pace of progress in science has not really been matched by the pace of progress in global health policy. And in specific, there are a number of new technologies that are incredibly exciting and powerful in terms of our response to an emerging infectious disease, such as COVID-19, where the pace of scientific discovery and the promise of it is really pretty substantial, but we don't have specific pathways in place to make sure that everyone who can benefit from the best in science can really get access to it. And that's really not just a ethical and humanitarian imperative to solve for that issue. It's also a public health one as well when we're dealing with a pandemic. What I want to talk about is to use a specific example of monoclonal antibodies for COVID-19 prevention and treatment. As you saw on the slide that has the heading, monoclonal antibodies as a bridge to COVID-19 vaccine, which I'm not sure if that's being projected or not. It's the next slide, please. This is fine. So there has been a lot of attention to this idea of monoclonal antibodies, which are, proteins that are identified initially from people who have been infected with COVID-19 that have the potent ability to neutralize virus infection. And they are very promising tools for not only the treatment and prevention of the disease. And while there's an active effort underway to expedite the development of a safe and efficacious vaccine, monoclonal antibodies have significant promise both for therapy, and you're reading a lot about how these are now entering the clinic for therapeutic indications for COVID-19 treatment, but they also have significant promise for prophylaxis, either individuals who don't respond well to vaccines when they're available or when you need rapid onset of immunity to deal with an outbreak. So really, the most effective response will be one that includes both vaccines as well as therapeutics, as well as other prophylactic tools. And monoclonal antibodies are a very promising element of that, which all sounds great until you look at information such as that, which is found on the next slide, which is, I think many of you know, that monoclonal antibodies have really transformed modern medical care. I mean, it's just amazing how cancer care or care of autoimmune diseases and many other diseases have been transformed by monoclonal antibody technology. And as a result of that, both because they have such of a favorable medical impact, and they are also very commercially successful products, it's not surprising that the vast majority or a significant majority of the pharmaceutical pipelines are now composed of monoclonal antibody-based products, which, sounds great on the innovation space, but when you look at the access space, it's a much more problematic story. And this was just told in significant detail by a call to action that the Wellcome Trust and IAVI published just 2 weeks ago, and you can see the web link there. And the bottom line is that there is no greater inequity in terms of access to medical products than there is in the case of monoclonal antibodies. The vast majority, close to 98% of these products, are only available in wealthy countries to people who have good insurance. And even though diseases are globally prevalent, these products are not available. And one reason is a lack of affordability. They can cost over $100,000 a year. There's not the policy frameworks and regulatory frameworks to put them in place. Next slide, please. But in this context of COVID, it's a case where we all know by definition this is a pandemic. The problem is everywhere. If we develop an effective solution, how are we going to make sure that it's available everywhere where it's needed? And right now there are over 70 monoclonal antibodies against COVID-19 that are in development, and 8 are already in the clinic, with 2 are in phase 3 programs. And I think many people in the field think that there's a significant probability that these will be shown to be safe and efficacious, at least some of them. And if that is borne out by the data, what are we going to do? We will have these products for which there isn't a plan to make them globally available, and it will really be a very vivid example where people living in wealthy countries are benefiting, but people living in lower and middle income countries are not. If we can go to the next slide, please. But in the case of the vaccine development effort, there's been tremendous and appropriate efforts put in place, not only to think about global access, but to think about making investments at risk for manufacturing scale up, policy frameworks to expedite implementation. You've heard from a number of speakers, and you'll hear from more about planning efforts to deliver the vaccines to people who need them. But in the case of monoclonal antibodies, really none of that is taking place. We need to sort of think about how do we make these products, which may well prove to be life-saving and disease preventing, available to everyone who can need them. We need to sort of think about the product profile. We need to think about affordability. We need to think about generating the data in clinical trials to support local use. We need to think about how we have the kind of product development partnerships that are seen in the vaccine space to make them available both in terms of affordability and supply. And we need to think about how these are going to be, procured and regulated. And really, there's not much that's taking place in that arena. Next slide, please. I think many of you are familiar with the ACT Accelerator mechanism and have heard a lot already about things like the COVAX initiative for vaccines, which is really very positive. The ACT Accelerator, though, also includes efforts beyond vaccines to include therapeutics and diagnostics. But if you look at the amount of money that's allocated between the different pillars of the ACT Accelerator, you can see that they vary substantially. And of the $30 billion that has been targeted for mobilization, only about $7 billion is in the therapeutics range, and unfortunately only about 10% of that has actually been mobilized. So there's a very significant gap in terms of a big agenda of things that we have on our to-do list and not a lot of funding available to do it. And if you go to the next slide, please. You can see it graphically demonstrated here about the disparity between investments globally in vaccine activities, which is really the vast majority of the top bar, and the therapeutics, which would include monoclonal antibodies as well as other activities through other mechanisms, which are really much smaller. And these are the amounts of funding that have been targeted and not the amount of money that's actually been allocated. So we're really, I think, going down the track quickly towards a situation where we're going to have products that are shown to be efficacious and safe, and potentially the most efficacious therapeutics that we have, at least in the near term. And we're going to have a situation where access is not globally available. The last slide is really sort of thinking about what do we need to do? I mean, we need to sort of actually map out what's going to be necessary to make sure people can benefit from these products if they are in fact shown to be efficacious. We need to sort of think about how to deal with the same access questions you all have been talking about in terms of vaccines. And I think we also need to sort of raise awareness, generate advocacy and mobilize investment to take on these challenges, because otherwise we're going to face what is, probably the greatest inequity since the original challenges faced around access to antiretroviral therapy for HIV. We solve that. We need to figure out how to solve it for diseases like COVID-19. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. Let me turn it now to Gavin Yamey. Gavin?
Thanks for the invitation. Thanks also to Margaret for setting up this panel so beautifully. I want to spend 5 minutes or so reflecting on vaccine nationalism. We've heard this term before today, that I consider to be a giant threat to achieving global herd immunity. That's what we're going to need to end the pandemic. We know we're not going to get there from natural infection alone. We've seen, for example, in France and Spain, they were very hard hit by the pandemic. Only about 5% of the population in surveys have antibodies. We're going to need a vaccine. Clearly, progress has been astonishingly rapid. The time from lab to jab was just 63 days. That's the time from when China shared the genetic sequence to the first human trials. And the WHO dashboard says we've now got 30 human trials. 6 are in phase 3, the most advanced before. So we're more rapid than mumps. That was the fastest, 4 years. We're on a faster trajectory. Ebola was 5 years. But Michael Ryan, word of caution from Michael Ryan, one of my favorite people in the world, the guy who's leading the executive director of the WHO Health Emergencies Program, he said if this is going to be successful, it's going to require one of the greatest scientific, one of the greatest political, one of the greatest financial, one of the greatest public health operations in a generation. It's absolutely true. This is unprecedented what's going to be needed in terms of cooperation between governments, funders, vaccine manufacturers. We've heard this term at-risk manufacturing a lot today. That's the notion that we can't wait till we have a safe, effective vaccine and then spend 2 or 3 years making it, manufacturing it. We've got to start manufacturing it now, even though actually we don't know which ones are going to be successful. So we will be throwing away some money at the same time. Adding to that challenge, of course, is the notion of distributing it in ways that are sound ethically and adopting public health principles. We heard from Angela Shen earlier about high-risk groups who are likely to be prioritized. I worry that in those discussions, we're not hearing a lot about other vulnerable populations, people of color, prisoners, the homeless. The 10 biggest outbreaks right now in the United States are all in jails and prisoners. And we heard Garth Graham asking, are we going to be engaging at the top end with at-risk communities? So I would like to hear more about that. I know that Nicole Lurie was quite optimistic that we've learned lessons from H1n1. I'm not so sure. As she mentioned, many rich countries monopolized the supply of vaccine, and low and middle-income countries got less dose later. Are we learning lessons now and putting in place a system that's different? This is where I perhaps start to sound more like an activist than an academic. I have signed, as many of you perhaps have done as well, the Free the Vaccine pledge that the Universities Allied for Essential Medicines is co-leading. And that envisages a world that, unfortunately, we do not have, a system of open source, open access innovation, everybody putting their patents in patent pools, transparent pricing, sharing of patents, sharing of manufacturing technology, everybody pooling together, holding their hands in harmony, putting money into a shared pool according to their means, and then allocating vaccines to everyone who needs them worldwide, free at the point of care, particularly with concern for vulnerable groups and for strengthening vaccine delivery systems. We chose not to do that this time round. And we've already seen giant bilateral purchase agreements happening between rich countries and individual vaccine manufacturers. Hundreds of millions of doses now hoarded by rich countries. Vaccine nationalism, and of course, that term vaccine nationalism applies to vaccine, but we've seen it for other products as well. You may have seen in July the United States purchasing literally almost every single dose on the planet of remdesivir. We've seen other rich countries monopolizing personal protective equipment and masks, and actually, to be honest, even drugs used in intensive care units. And that is a threat. That's a threat to achieving global herd immunity. It's actually a threat to us resuming sort of normal social and economic activities. Now, Nicole and others did mention COVAX. That is 3 partners, Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, the World Health Organization, and CEPI, which is developing and manufacturing COVID-19 vaccines. They are saying that they will aim to deliver 2 billion doses by the end of next year. They're asking for $2 billion by the end of this year to make it happen. And if you participate in COVAX, if you are a participating nation, you would be guaranteed a supply of vaccine, enough to vaccinate 20% of your population. That's the guarantee. You, the country, will decide who gets priority, but that is the guarantee. And there are 2 ways to participate. If you are a rich country, high income or upper middle income country, you will participate as a self-financing country. So you will commit to buying from COVAX enough doses to cover 20% of your population, and you will make an upfront payment. And with that upfront payment, that's going to help to support these advanced purchase agreements that are needed. It's going to cover some of these at-risk costs that we talked about. And we're going to have a lot of wealthy countries participating for COVAX to work. And actually, obviously, the more countries that participate in COVAX, the better for everybody. You can then reduce the risks, the financial risks of manufacturing scale-up, so-called de-risking. You can bring down prices. If there are lots of people in a pool, you can bring down prices. And, of course, it'll allow you to buy more doses. And then the other group that will participate are the low-income countries and lower middle-income countries, and they will be so-called funded countries. Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, will pay for those countries to get doses. Now, whether or not this mechanism, and for disclosure, I was consulted on this mechanism early on, whether or not it succeeds or fails is going to depend on whether people come to the table, particularly rich countries. And as we've talked about today, a lot of rich countries are already making their own deals. They're going it alone. So why on earth would they participate in COVAX? What COVAX is saying is it's an insurance policy. You don't know. You might be the United States. You've gone into a deal with, say, Novavax, a true deal. But that vaccine fails. It's not safe. It's not effective. If you had purchased doses through COVAX, at least you will have enough for 20% of the population. This time next week, D-Day, August the 31, that is the day. A week from now, the first financially binding commitments are going to be made. So in a week, we'll know a bit more about whether we're on course. As many of you know, there are some concerning signs. Some very big countries who have not expressed interest. The EU, for example, saying they're not going to buy vaccine from COVAX. So I do worry. And what I want to just leave you with in just the last minute or two is weird for an activist perhaps to be saying this, but we at Duke have actually been starting to think through these giant bilateral deals. Would there be a way to encourage those to be more globally minded? So we've just done some work led by Professor David McAdams in the business school with Matthew Johnson in the Duke Human Vaccine Institute and my team at the Center for Policy Impact in Global Health, Sondu Abwoji, Casey Kennedy McDade, Siddharth Dixit, where we have been trying to understand, is there a way to actually incentivize those bilateral deals to be done in a way that could potentially be win-win? We've been using the idea of kind of safe harbor criteria. You could perhaps define criteria where those deals are set up in a way that expands and not contracts, that expands the global vaccine supply. And you could therefore perhaps move those deals towards more of a global good. For example, what if the manufacturer involved in the bilateral deal agreed to share the know-how, agreed to share the technology? What if the deal expanded the global supply of multiple inputs that could otherwise be constraining production of the COVAX vaccines? We would say, look, it's pretty clear those bilateral deals are happening whether we like it or not. I don't like it. That's not the world I had wished for. But here we are. Maybe defining and articulating these criteria could help improve the situation for low and middle income country. Maybe it'll help to tackle vaccine nationalism. And maybe it's one way in which we can reach global herd immunity. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Gavin. And finally, we will hear from Rebecca Weintraub, and then we'll move to question and answer. But Rebecca, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alan, and just tremendous panel. Thank you, Peggy, for being our guide today, and the Health Affairs team and the sponsors. Really going to build upon Gavin's comments here and related to the first panel's definition of value in the midst of a global pandemic. And as a health professional and a provider, I think about how do we now deliver billions of doses of the vaccine, something we've never done as a monumental global task. Next slide, please. So in a crisis, leadership matters. And Gavin spoke to the development of COVAX. And Dr. Tedros has said the following: under the COVID vaccine global access facility, doses will be allocated proportionately, simultaneously, to reduce overall risk. If we do not protect these high-risk people from the virus everywhere and at the same time, we cannot stabilize health systems and rebuild the global economy. And not only is this a massive orchestration, but it's also dealing with the wave and the counter of the nation-first strategy that Gavin just mentioned. Mark also noted that COVAX does not have the current pull power in the global market, and to note, only 10 of the G20 have actually expressed interest in participating in the COVAX facility as of today. So therefore, once again, once we even have the first generation of COVID vaccine approved, they will be hustled into one of the most complicated public health campaigns of all time. Next slide, please. So we need to prepare. This map displays how a minister of health distributes scheduled vaccines and the flows of the product and the data. Tracking patients and their COVID-19 vaccinations will be a longitudinal exercise in record keeping. Every nation is facing this challenge to track the flow of the product, the flow of the data, and to monitor and evaluate vaccine delivery. Every nation, sometimes every state, is doing it differently in ways that are not often compatible. So we need to leverage the expertise to predict demand and optimize the supply of the vaccine. Next slide, please. We also have a pretty narrow window here. We need to have better estimates of the pace of vaccine manufacturing. A candidate manufacturing for early stage clinical trials is often in the supply doses of thousands. Now we need to scale up manufacturing to commercial scale, to billions of doses, which will face different bottlenecks. And we'll be sharing our early findings in a few weeks. Next slide, please. So throughout this panel, I think we've spoken about all four of these areas: the complexity of vaccine literacy. How do we have a vaccine confident workforce and public? Allocation, distribution, and verification. All four of these require right now leveraging prediction, planning, and monitoring to integrate these services. To begin with literacy, there's tremendous expertise sitting at the Vaccine Confidence Project, where they've mapped the network effects of misinformation. We now need to translate these methods to inform and tailor campaigns to counter the infodemic. Our team has joined the Convince Coalition to promote COVID-19 vaccine acceptance among private sector employees and employers. And there's tremendous research to show that employers are now the most trusted sources of information about the pandemic response. Allocation, we've spoken about the complexity of vaccine nationalism. We also must test the WHO allocation principles into practice. For example, there's a percentage benchmark to reflect the percentage of healthcare workers and your elderly populations. Now, this is not necessarily equitable. For example, Norway has more health professionals in older population than Malawi. We now need a governance mechanism to monitor and enforce these allocation principles as doses of the vaccine portfolio become available. Distribution, the complexity of getting the right product at the right temperature to the right person at the right time will require real-time data and must respond to these changes in allocation. Next slide. And now verification. Considering the geographic spread of the at-risk populations, vaccine verification will be essential to quantify vaccine coverage. Gavi and the Gavi-infused partners have already been early adopters to invest in digital biometrics. The evidence is clear that many people on the globe don't have formal identification, and we need to build these global services. We will need, number one, global standards to protect privacy. Number two, systems capable of serving both adults and children and adults. And number three, global standards to promote interoperability. As a reminder, during the Ebola crisis, we had a rush of technologies that were hastily assembled and many of those tools are now abandoned. So before we begin to rush the funding, let's generate a roadmap to identify which services we need and how we'll integrate them within health information systems. Next slide. So I hope several of you have played the game Pandemic prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. This is a game that was actually tailored about 12 months ago by a tremendous set of coalition partners. And we've been playing this board game, and all players to begin the game must commit to this universal goal on the top center corner. Everyone is protected. Each round of the game, there are different shocks to the system. There are changes in leadership. There's new investment vehicles and new government structures. Now, insights from the simulation have been clear. Number one, we need to prepare a vaccine-confident workforce. Number two, we need to set global standards on privacy, on data ownership, and interoperability. And number three, we must leverage this narrow window today to plan and predict systems for the portfolio of treatments and vaccines. Next slide, please. So in many ways, many folks in the panel today reminded me of Dan Heath's quote here about upstream leaders. To succeed upstream, leaders must detect problems early, target leverage points in complex systems, find reliable ways to measure success, pioneer new ways of working together, and embed their successes into systems to give them permanence. Looking forward to working upstream together. Thank you, Peggy. Thank you, Alan. Back to you.
Okay, what a terrific set of comments. I have quite a few questions, but let me get started. I am interested, Angela, you, I think, were the first to sort of make reference to the Vaccines for Children program in the U.S. When I think about global distribution and distribution channels, the age profile of the highest risk group for COVID is not a perfect match for a lot of the vaccine systems that we've had, which have primarily focused on children and to some extent mothers. I just wonder if from both a U.S. and a global perspective, I could get some comments from folks on how we need, what we've learned from more child-oriented, but also what we need to think about differently, given that this is a somewhat different risk profile. And maybe there are other diseases that are more similar to this that have some lessons for us. Who could help us with this topic?
Well, I'm going to jump in first and then let others.
Okay, Peggy, go ahead.
But, first, I think, there's a little bit of a concern about, are we actually studying the vaccine in the populations that ultimately may receive it? Children may not be at the top of the priority list in terms of the distribution of vaccines for COVID-19, given who is most at risk and limited supply, but they're not part of clinical studies at the moment, so we have to think about that. But other vulnerable populations, including pregnant women and people with certain kinds of comorbidities, may be inadequately underrepresented. And then going back to some of what Garth was talking about, we know that people of color, sadly, are quite underrepresented in the clinical trials of the vaccines to date. So I think all of those are issues that we need to be addressing now. The point was raised by someone, maybe a couple of people, about, how huge the challenge of actually not just distributing the vaccine, but tracking its proper use and monitoring, especially for potential emerging safety concerns, but better understanding efficacy as well, importantly, duration of protection. And, probably our sort of most robust systems for vaccination and tracking are in this country in the pediatric population. But we have a very fragmented system. Certainly, there have been indications in Operation Warp Speed that we may also bring in the military to help distribute vaccines. And I think we need to better understand what that might look like, but it may, from a logistical point of view, be beneficial, but it also may raise a lot of concerns and worry in certain populations and groups that we need to have access to. So these are really important questions, both in terms of understanding the science, safety, and effectiveness of the vaccine, but also how we're going to distribute it and monitor for its ongoing appropriate use. And we can't put those off. We need to be working on those now, along with all of the other ongoing activities.
Angela, I think you wanted to jump in. Yes.
I did. I wanted to make the point that a lot of our experience is important in building off of our routine immunization system, whether or not that's here in the U.S. or the EPI programs across the nation's low and middle income countries abroad, across the board. And I think that to your comment pointing to VFC, naturally astute that the Vaccines for Children program addresses a different population, children up through age 19. The process is important in terms of our experience with logistics. States are familiar with how to order, how distribution channels work, and the pathways. While the targets are different here, there's something not to be taken lightly, years of experience that we've had in refining this, not just in the U.S., but in the logistics experience with UNICEF, Supply Division, Gavi, other international partners in EPI programs as well. So as you astutely point out that the target groups are different, the providers are different. We're not targeting pediatricians and much more adult providers, more pharmacists, which we expanded greatly in 2009. I think that to answer a bit of your question is really that we do have a vast amount of experience in our respective routine immunization programs, EPI and otherwise.
Gavin?
A couple of quick points. Firstly, it's true that absolutely reducing mortality is going to be the imperative when we have limited doses. But I think a pediatrician pointed out to me early on in the pandemic that because of what Angela and Margaret have been saying, because we've got this system in place, that when we're thinking about herd immunity, vaccinating children could actually become a much higher priority than it is right now. So that might be a sort of a second phase. The second thing to say is, long COVID appears to be something like, I don't know, there are some data suggesting it could be as many as 10% who have post-acute COVID. It's clear that that can happen in young people. There's no doubt about that. The complications can be very severe. We've seen, lung, cardiac, etc., myocarditis. And so we shouldn't discount the importance of vaccinating young people from that point. And then lastly, the notion of soldiers being used to vaccinate Americans makes me and perhaps many people on this panel nervous. We've already got the Trump administration using federal officers, to quash civil protests, which has been catastrophically appalling. The notion that we're going to be sending in the military, that is not going to help to develop herd immunity in the United States, I would proffer.
Let me turn to another question, although if others want to join in, but we don't need everyone to weigh in on every. I want to follow up with a few items around vaccine hesitancy. So, Garth, I think you would agree with me that in the U.S., the public face of vaccine hesitancy is not the Black and brown communities. It's the sort of educated white communities. At least that's what you see in the media. So I have a lot of, I don't know if that resonates with you, but it leads me to a number of questions that I hope a number of you will join in on. The first is the degree to which, I know that vaccine hesitancy is a global phenomenon, but I wonder if it has some of the same racial and ethnic overtones or dimensions that it has in the U.S. Mark, I'm curious. We always talk about vaccine hesitancy. You spent your entire presentation was about treatment. Is there such a thing as treatment hesitancy, or is there something unique about vaccines that gets people, thinking that untoward things will happen to them? This is such a central question to the distribution and the actual receipt of a treatment as it comes along, or a vaccine as it comes along. I'd like to spend a little bit more time on it. Who'd like to get started?
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in first.
Please.
Because it's interesting, I think, how this has evolved. I think there is a slight difference between regular vaccine hesitancy and kind of what we're seeing developing with COVID vaccine hesitancy. There was an interesting Washington Post article that showed, like in states like Colorado, you see sometimes the traditional anti-vax groups who have reached out and now partnering with a lot of the local civil rights organizations around how, this fear around vaccines and how bad it's going to be, particularly for minority communities. So it may not be that where you see the traditional anti-vax discussion as you see it before, especially in minority communities. Now, you definitely see a higher rate of hesitancy towards the potential COVID-19 vaccine from what you see with kind of Black and brown communities, at least from some of the survey data, compared to what you normally see. So I do think there is a difference, and in terms of how that is evolving. The problem is that could create a perfect storm where you have, you have communities that need it the most, having been predisposed, early setup, early kind of maneuvering and early dynamics that set up to leave this community worse off than others, if a vaccine comes to market. The last thing I'll say is, but you do see globally a lot of interesting, waves of information. There was an interesting article. There's a lot of media that started, and it's a lot of viral information when people got upset around something that a group of European doctors said in terms of testing and what's going to happen in Africa. What they thought, and then how that kind of created a movement on its own. So what I will just venture to say is it's not exactly what we've seen before. Much of COVID isn't exactly what we've seen before. So we have to be thoughtful and strategic ahead of time now to be able to get to where we need to be.
Who else would like to jump in on this? Rebecca, yes, please.
Yes, just to build upon Garth's comment, I highly recommend reading Heidi Larson's book, Stuck, that just came out about a month ago. She really does detail the social vectors that have transmitted rumors into vaccine hesitancy and how diverse the vectors are, and that the vaccine hesitancy is not a movement of a singular group of people who are at a margin, but actually those who are undecided actually are expressing hesitancy in how the vaccine's being produced, how the vaccine's being manufactured, the steps along the value chain from the discovery of vaccine to the delivery of the vaccine. The second, I'll just say, and I know it's somewhat obvious, but the amount of content that's been developed that's permeating our systems has led to even a younger population that is expressing vaccine hesitancy that's independent of race, gender, ethnicity, geographic location. So this infodemic is not located in one county in California, but it's actually quite diverse, and we really do need to tailor our campaigns based on these demographics.
I think building on what Rebecca and Garth said, that even by virtue of kind of the moniker or the name Operation Warp Speed, it's trying to emote a certain kind of sense of obviously speed and efficiency, but there have been some unintended consequences to even kind of dubbing, the coordinated government effort. I think there is a long history in our field of vaccine science and policy of unintended consequences with the greatest of intentions. And so, towards the earlier points of Garth and Rebecca around how this looks very different, it looks even different within the spectrum of those who are vaccine acceptors, in addition to the gray area in between, that this kind of effort itself. I think Gavin is the one who said that it was from jab to something. I wrote it down. It's very bumper sticker-like of 63 days. And so even us as, vaccinologists, scientists, what have you, we marvel at the coordinated public and private effort that's occurred. And I'm not exactly sure amongst the different gradations of healthcare and scientists, as well as the general public and the different flavors of the population, by however you cut that up, really fully appreciate the totality of all the things that are going on. And so Operation Warp Speed, I think, is kind of one characterization that, makes us kind of take pause on a number of things for which hesitancy looks very different for each vaccine. individuals are hesitant, perhaps for influenza versus for measles, hesitancy in low and middle income countries have to do with perhaps how they were treated at the health facility by the healthcare worker. And you overlay all that, I think Garth said, the normal stuff with what Rebecca touched on in Heidi's book, as well as, the COVID piece. And you have a nice complex, I don't know if it was wine, it would really taste very interesting, but it's very complicated. And the name in and of itself, kind of alludes to that, I think.
Well, and I have to say there's a very bitter taste to the wine when the very agency, the FDA in this country, that's been charged with, really overseeing the sound science and regulatory review of vaccines, is being attacked. The environment of politicization, the clear pressure on decision making, that all adds to the doubt. And of course, I think some failures in transparency about how decisions are being made. And, unfortunately, we're seeing science by press release in some circumstances where we're getting information not through the normal channels. And I do really worry that this is adding a new form of vaccine hesitancy to even some of the most sophisticated vaccinologists and others about can we really trust a vaccine? So we've got to get a handle on this now, because the issues are too important. We cannot, just sort of say, well, this is a challenging world, but it is what it is. We have to find a better path.
Very quickly, I think last night the press event around convalescent plasma was perhaps a warm-up for what might be an October surprise emergency authorization of a COVID-19 vaccine that has been inadequately tested. That, I think, could be a massive setback.
Okay, we're coming towards the end, and I do, because I know we'll lose a few listeners, I have another question teed up, but I do just want to make sure our audience is aware that this event is possible only with support from our sponsors, and I do want to list them one more time before we wrap up. They are Anthem, Amgen, Avalere, Kaiser Permanente, the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America, Gilead, McKesson, Quest Diagnostics, Dynavax, Alexion, and Danaher. No control over the content, but their resources were definitely necessary for this, and the companion papers that we'll be publishing in November on a range of topics as well. I want to turn to the question of within-country distribution. And Gavin, you, of course, teed up the topic of nationalism, but nationalism is the superstructure under which there are massive allocation decisions, as we've discussed in the United States. And I'm just wondering if there's any reflection here on successful models or things to avoid with respect to approaches to within-country distribution, whether it's more likely or more viable to have cross-country multilateral agreements and plans if there's more attention paid to that, or if, frankly, countries that are willing to participate in a global mechanism want to be left alone when it comes to internal distribution. The two seem related, and I wonder if we could get some insight into how they are. Not getting any takers. Okay, I don't want to.
I can make a general comment for lack of
Sure.
for the need of filling a void. I'm not sure if I fully appreciated the depth of your question, but I think that what is evident is, especially in the United States, there's this balance between federal and states' responsibilities and authorities, perhaps now more so than ever, given how things are rolling out. And I think that there's an appreciation there towards how each of the states or communities in other countries govern at the local level, for which some of their laws around healthcare delivery, really kind of dictate, what's like the best way to treat their population. I think this really addresses the point that public health is local and localized, and how states best do that, whether or not they work, largely with expanded providers like pharmacists, whether or not they work largely with private providers, whether or not they set up external mass vaccination sites or what have you. I think that it is, particularly in the United States, very localized into how they best optimize the target populations you're trying to get at.
I think Angela makes an excellent point. But I also want to stress the importance of really having national guidance and clear articulation of a strategy that spells out, what are the critical goals and objectives, and who are the stakeholders that need to be engaged, and also recognizing that this is both too important to have everyone trying their own de novo strategies. It also is a communicable disease, so that other states and regions can be compromised if bad decisions are made in neighboring areas. So while public health certainly is local, and I served for 6 years as a local health commissioner in New York City, I recognize the importance of a coordinated approach that has leadership at the national level, but also recognizes the need to adapt policies and programs to the specific needs of your locality, your communities, and your systems for getting things done effectively.
Okay, so I'm going to wind us down to two last questions. One, I think, is directed to Mark. As I listened to the presentation, I was thinking money, high income, low income, the problem is money. And then toward the end, you made reference to HIV/AIDS, and I'm curious the lessons from that experience that go beyond just the need for money, given what you, very passionately described as potentially the largest inequity globally imaginable, that with a potential solution. So other than just coming up with large sums, drawing from the AIDS experience, what does it take to overcome that hurdle?
Sure. So it's an important question. There's a long answer, and I would encourage people to go to the Wellcome Trust website to download the report that talks about this, because it wasn't a gloom and doom report. It was trying to define solutions, both in the sort of scientific as well as policy frameworks that can get us there. To answer your question, I think the first thing is to acknowledge that you can't take no for an answer. I think those of us who were involved in the early days of antiretroviral therapy remember very well that people said it will never be possible. These products are too expensive. People won't be able to implement them in resource limited settings. We know now that with concerted action and creative partnerships, that's simply not true. I think the solution for HIV antiretroviral drug access is not going to be the solution here, just because biologics are fundamentally different from, small molecule antiviral drugs. However, I think the solutions really come at the interface between science, technology, and policy innovation. And, that's basically what we sought to spell out in the, call to action with the Wellcome Trust about how do we begin. But a lot of it, comes down to, I think Phyllis was the one who highlighted the kinds of interesting partnerships that are coming together, not only between the public and private sector, but also between private sector entities to address an emerging infectious disease threat. I think similar kinds of creative partnerships can provide the solution to this challenge as well.
You let us off in the response around the need to work with communities and in communities. And you started to talk about successes, and I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about where the leadership is coming from to do that hard work. I envision the importance of that work occurring well before a vaccine is actually available, not just because of the trials and the participation in trials, but just to overcome legitimately developed decades of mistrust. So who is leading that charge?
Yeah. So I'll say this, never underestimate the power of communities. One of the things that we've learned in this experience, especially as we delve into COVID-19 testing, et cetera, there are a lot of community leaders who are doing amazing things, talking to their community about getting tested. You have people from the entertainment community, people from different parts of local communities that are already taking on this mantle. The thing we need to do is to combine and equip them with science and create the partnerships, create the funding, and create those relationships. And hopefully what I was trying to explain at the beginning is that to get around these longstanding issues, we need to think through things that we've never done before and realize the strength in local communities. And you see this both globally and domestically in terms of being able to understand that. The leadership, I think, needs to come from both ends. I think, kind of individuals represented here, folks in government, folks who reach down in the community and connect with the people there who are local leaders already. I'm a big fan, Alan, if I didn't say this, of free clinics. We partnered with them, and they're just an amazing group, community health centers, and the folks who run those kinds of organizations. I would put them at the top of the list in terms of the kinds of leaders we need. Or we have, not we need, they're already there. Exactly.
That's great. Well, this has been such a rich conversation, Peggy. Thank you for kicking us off and setting the framework for the discussion, to each of you for your contributions. The blending of the domestic and global, I think, if I may say, I think it worked very well. The issues are related, similar, not identical, but we're certainly confronting many of the same. So I'm appreciative to all of you for giving your time today. To you in the audience, thank you for sticking with us. It's been a full afternoon, but I hope you have found it worthwhile. And we're publishing nonstop at Health Affairs on this topic. So in addition to watching this, you can see blogs and journal articles covering a tremendous range associated with COVID-19. With that, and my appreciation, we will say it's been a great event, and we'll see you next time. And thank you. Good day.
Thank you.